Judas and the Black Messiah pits Daniel Kaluuya as civil rights activist Fred Hampton against Lakeith Stanfield as FBI asset William O'Neill, in a political thriller directed by new-ish director Shaka King. But is it any good? Let's find out.
18 months for the stolen car. 5 years for impersonating a federal officer. Or you can go home.
The Black Panthers are forming a rainbow coalition of oppressed brothers and sisters of every color.
Their aim is to sow hatred and inspire terror.
I will learn all that I can.
These ain't no terrorists.
You can murder a liberator, but you can't murder liberation. You can murder a revolutionary, but you can't murder revolution. And you can murder a freedom fighter, but you can't murder freedom.
The Black Messiah of the title is Fred Hampton, deputy chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party and a rising star in their ranks. Freaked out by his meteoric rise in popularity, J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, wants to take him down. Enter Judas, aka William O'Neill. A petty criminal, he's picked up after a crime by FBI handler Bill Mitchell and set to task infiltrating and undermining the Panthers. Set over a tumultuous but short time period in the late 60s, the film quickly establishes its history with an opening montage of archive footage explaining the Panthers and their place in the civil rights movement. This is an excellent primer, by the way, for a time period that's often swept under the rug. And I think one of the film's primary aims is to expose that time period, expose what happened in it, and it does an excellent job in doing that. Most importantly, in this montage we meet Fred Hampton, played with amazing ability by Daniel Kaluuya. Hampton is a politician, and one noted for his charisma and speaking ability at that, so Kaluuya spends much of his screen time delivering speeches, and I think he more than rises to that challenge. Kaluuya, I think, is quickly developing into one of the most interesting actors around. He's supremely charismatic, and he's able to balance this sort of righteous anger with a light touch of humour, or more even maybe just a wink and a nod towards those small truths of the world, a sly look here and there, along with these showman-like calls and responses. So the film's top set pieces really are his speeches, and it's also there that King's directing is at its best. Throughout the film, there's also a focus on the actual day-to-day activities of the Panthers, which makes it kind of singular to me. I don't think I've seen much like this. I think even Malcolm X, which is kind of my gold standard for films about the Black civil rights movement in America, really devotes that much time to the kind of actual activities involved in activism every day. It's much more about Malcolm as this kind of great figure. And so, by the way, my question to you is if you do know any more movies that kind of deal with that day-to-day activity of civil rights and activism, political activism, then do let me know. And I'm particularly interested in fiction in this case. I've seen a few documentaries about political stuff, but always interested to find out more fiction that's political in nature. The other thing about this is that it really serves to underscore that the majority of the Panthers' activities were basically feeding kids and educating their members. Now, yes, obviously there was a lot of militarism tied up in the party, but more often than not, at least in the depiction that the film gives, it's the result of them being pushed into a corner by the constant escalating and undermining that the FBI is engaging in. And that's a story that we don't really hear that much about. For obvious reasons, I don't think many Americans want to confront the fact that the FBI ran an active disinformation campaign against its own citizens during that period. So anyway, that's the Black Messiah, Fred Hampton. What about Judas? Well, he's played by another fascinating, relatively new talent, Lakeith Stanfield. Despite his great filmography, I think he really jumped to my notice in Sorry to Bother You, and he also had some great supporting roles in both Knives Out and Uncut Gems last year. Now don't get me wrong, I think Daniel Kaluuya is great, like I said, but I'm always excited to sit down to watch a Lakeith Stanfield performance. There's something kind of slippery and unexpected about him as an actor. He has this laconic approach that makes him totally fascinating on screen. And I think that holds true here too, because while I think Kaluuya puts in an excellent traditional biopic performance, Stanfield takes the much less well-known O'Neill and pulls out all the stops to give him plenty of nasty character traits. Which is good news, because the film itself doesn't seem to give him much to work with. Despite the implicit two-hander you might be expecting from Kaluuya and Stanfield's equal billing and from, well, Judas coming before Black Messiah in the title, I really felt that director Shaka King and screenwriters Luke Besson and Kenny and Keith Lucas were much more interested in making this a Fred Hampton biopic. Now, I understand the impetus behind that. Like I said, his story is vitally important and it's not very well known or widely discussed nowadays. However, O'Neill is a really important character in the story that this film covers, and he gets lots of screen time, but barely any backstory or motivation. Well, let's talk about his introduction, for instance. It's fantastic and it's dynamic. He poses as an FBI officer, raids a bar to shake down the black patrons inside, and then confiscates the nice car that's waiting outside, that's owned by one of the guys in the bar. It's a really clever set piece that sets him up as a man who can pass with many identities, and obviously has quite loose morals. That makes him a great asset to the FBI's infiltration program, but also a kind of foil to Kaluuya's honest ideals. And then, after that, we get almost nothing about him. Which is important because, unlike almost every other black character in the film, O'Neill is actively working to bring down the Black Panthers. He's the villain of the movie, and we never really get a clear idea as to why. I don't feel like I know much about O'Neill except what Stanfield intimates via his obviously typically excellent performance. He's the first name in the title, he's the first main character we meet in the flesh, but the movie doesn't seem to be about him. Oh, okay, I mean he's in it and it's about what he did, but Hampton is the focus. Which, like I said, makes sense, he's a more important figure, but I need a bit of motivation in the man I know will betray him. With the film switching between political speeches and thriller elements, it feels sometimes a bit like a more compact Black Klansman. Unfortunately, I feel that what it gains in being more of a straightforward thriller also makes it a less interesting take on the events that it depicts. Still, it's a compelling, well-acted and well-realised recounting of one of the darkest episodes in American political history, and one that's of vital importance. But that's just my take, and I'd love to hear yours. So let me know in the comments below what you thought of Judas and the Black Messiah. Are you hankering, like me, for more meaty roles for Lakeith Stanfield to sink his teeth into? Are you enjoying seeing more Hollywood movies looking at under-discussed episodes from Black American political history? Let's have a chat about it. That's it from me, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
David, look! They're wheels! Wheels?
여기 대체 어디야?
집이지?
The Yee family has just moved to their new home, a static trailer on a large plot of land in Arkansas. Dad Jacob has dreams of starting a farm, while Mum Monica remains unconvinced. Monica's mother Sunja arrives to look after the kids, but as the farm falters, the family begins to strain under the pressure.
Oh, pretty boy, pretty boy.
I'm not pretty. I'm good looking.
Minari draws extensively on the life story of writer-director Lee Isaac Chung, who, like David, spent his childhood on a farm in Arkansas. This means that the film is full of rich details, like proud dad Jacob refusing the services of a water dowser, and the family's eccentric and hyper-religious neighbour Paul. But there's also a more recent force of meaning behind the film, written by Chung when he was on the verge of retiring from filmmaking entirely. In that context, Jacob's desperation to make something of his life and of the farm comes across as a particularly personal story. It's a very small-scope plot in some ways. It's largely focused on the rhythms of daily life for the Yee family, the labour of working on the farm and the hatchery. But the drudgery of the work contrasts with the constant slow motion, lush views of greenery drenched in golden natural light, which combined with the contemplative Emile Mosseri's score gives the film a dreamy feel. And isn't Mosseri a genius? Just listen to that music. He made a huge splash with the tremendous, bombastic, brassy score for The Last Black Man in San Francisco, but with Minari he's made something humble, yet revelatory. Jacob might be working on a small-scale family farm, but to him it's paradise. Speaking of paradise, religion recurs throughout Minari and plays an important role in understanding the film, I think. Monica insists that the family go to church, she's always asking David to pray at night so that he might see heaven. She sets a lot of store by folk medicine cures. Jacob refers to the farm as Eden. Paul, who joins him in labouring on the farm, drags a cross up and down the road on Sundays as his own individual act of worship. Now, the film can't exactly be called pro-religion. The few church services we actually see are pretty lifeless, and there's disagreements about the importance of religion within the household too, where Sunja and Jacob are much more sceptical of it than Monica. But there is a great importance placed on faith. The idea that you should put your hope for salvation in others and in the world around you. In carrying a cross, praying to see heaven, or trying to cultivate the Garden of Eden in one corner of Arkansas, each of the characters is seeking some kind of salvation. And for Jacob and Monica in particular, there's always the question of whether they'll lose their faith in each other. Faith and love being interchangeable in that way in the film. Jacob's skepticism becomes more and more pronounced as the farm fails. He turns away from putting his faith in the world, puts too much pressure on his own shoulders, and that affects his relationship with his family too. And you wonder how much that reflects Chung's feelings about his own work, considering the context in which he wrote the film. In one particularly moving moment, Jacob has overworked himself on the farm to the point where he can't raise his arms above his head. He has to ask Monica to wash his hair for him. He seems close to giving up, and so does Monica. It's a tender scene, and also one that sets the stakes. For Jacob, losing the farm means losing his family. For Monica, keeping the farm means losing the family. And working out how to square that conflict is the main crux of their storyline. Away from the Monica and Jacob storyline, which motivates a lot of the plot, the film also focuses on the developing relationship between David and his grandma, Soon-Ya. Soon-Ya isn't like normal grandmas. She doesn't bake or cook, she can't read, she plays cards and curses all the time. But David isn't like the kids she's known either. He has a heart murmur, and the resulting limits on his exercise has made him shy and restricted his confidence. He wets the bed, maybe due to the anxiety of the family struggles that are going on, or maybe just because he's a kid. He favours this bizarre outfit of a yellow tank top, gym shorts, tube socks and cowboy boots, which makes him a kind of striking character. I think he's richly realised by Chung, obviously drawing on his own experiences, and wonderfully performed by Alan Kim, who's already winning some very well-deserved awards. As his confidence grows, he's increasingly sparky, playing pranks on Grandma and enjoying the run of the farm. If the brain of the film is Jacob and Monica's plot, then the heart of it is David. Chung carefully balances the two plot lines of the film to create a rare gift of a movie, a naturalistic portrait of family life under pressure, where simple dreams and hopes are elevated to divine importance without becoming overly serious. Happily, it looks like Minari is going to be well recognised at the awards this year, and I highly recommend that you seek out and watch this absolutely stunning film. It's a warming, humanistic drama that I feel like I'll carry with me for years. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to chat with you in the comments below about this wonderful film, so do get down there and let's chat about the Yu family and their trials and tribulations. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Dear God, thank you for bringing us together as a family.
As Britain prepares to go to war with Nazi Germany, Marianne arrives at Morley House, the new posting of her vicar husband Linus, along with her daughter Adelaide. Unbeknownst to them, the last couple that lived in the house died in a horrific murder-suicide, one that their malevolent handler Bishop Malachi sought to cover up. Even worse, the demonic forces that motivated the crime are still hanging around the place, and make themselves known pretty sharpish. As the creepy goings-on begin to play havoc with the mental health of the house's inhabitants, Marianne joins forces with disgraced ghost hunter Harry Reid to get to the bottom of the building's sordid past.
What's the time, Stoll?
Addy?
The Banishing marks the return of director Christopher Smith to the horror genre, where he made his name in the noughties with British cult classics like Triangle and Severance. Now, those movies were marked out for their invention, for being sort of unique. Severance is basically a dark workplace comedy played as a horror, while Triangle uses this inventive misdirection and convoluted chronology to keep the viewer guessing. The Banishing treads, I think, altogether more familiar ground with its gothic religious horror, while still having enough stylistic flourishes to rise somewhat above the very crowded field. So the bare-bones supernatural plot of the film kicks off pretty sharply. Adelaide is barely in the house for a couple of minutes before she's found a creepy doll. Well, a few actually. There's your typical porcelain face with no eyes type of doll, and also some wrapped in rough cloaks made of sackcloth. You know, your more rustic variety of effigy. This is the first of many James Wan adjacent touches sprinkled throughout the film. It's clear that the intent was to model the supernatural elements of this on something like The Conjuring and its cinematic universe. Sure enough, a few scenes later, Adelaide is laying the dolls out in eerie tableaus of rituals and saying that they told her to do it. So far, so formulaic. But there is a fair bit more going on under the hood here. Quite quickly, the house starts to drive its inhabitants mad, but unlike lots of stories with that approach, this film actually goes some way to showing you how that works in practice. Early on, for instance, Marianne is sat at her dresser, brushing her hair, when someone, or something, watches through the keyhole. She turns when she hears a noise, at which point the film cuts to a dilapidated hospital corridor with a disoriented Marianne walking around it. She stops at a door and looks through a keyhole, seeing herself at the dresser. Now we're back in the room with her. It's an impressive bit of disjointed storytelling that retains just enough sense that you can follow it. And it's also a lot more inventive than the usual hallucinations people have in spooky movies, and I think quite reminiscent of sections of Triangle to boot, which by the way is a fab film if you haven't checked it out already. As it transpires, the house has a real talent for peeling back the layers of its inhabitants, preying on Linus and Marianne's insecurities in particular. It's quickly apparent that there's something off in their relationship. They don't seem to have lived together, they don't know each other's habits, and sex is off the cards entirely. This subtext of marital dysfunction and shame underpins lots of the film's psychodrama, much more successfully than the other subtext of the film, which is the idea that somehow the spooky goings-on at the house reflect the rise of fascism over in Europe. I just can't quite thread those two together. I don't really see the connection, and after watching the film, I'm not sure the filmmakers did either. But that's the subtext. The plain text of the film is very much standard demons and ghouls territory, and mostly ripped from real-life reports of hauntings at Borley Rectory. Do you get it? Morley House, Borley Rectory. Borley was once the supposedly most haunted location in the UK, and it was chiefly publicised by parapsychologist Harry Price. Yes, Harry Price, like Harry Reid in the film. Reading between the lines, it certainly seems that the idea for this was to be a Borley Rectory movie, and the IMDb cast list actually has actor Sean Harris down as playing Price, not called Reid, on that credit list. I wonder whether it was always supposed to be a kind of serial numbers filed off Borley Rectory movie. Nevertheless, in my mind, this actually makes the film a bit more palatable. I hate stuff that shows real-life ghost hunters as actually successful. Price was an interesting guy. He was an important figure in UK parapsychology and one who did lots of debunking, but he was also a relentless self-promoter and very hard to trust. He definitely falsified details about his own life and arguably about his cases as well. Now, I don't mind movies where ghosts and demons are real, but ones that portray real-life parapsychologists as correct and right about the world add to a mythology around them that's entirely undeserved. And yes, the Warrens of The Conjuring fame are absolutely the worst examples of this, although of course they call themselves demonologists. Still, this is fiction, and despite its suspiciously similar substitutes, Reid is not Price. He even has his own dark backstory invented for the movie. Harris is obviously good in the role, he's typically good, it's kind of expected. I think he's perhaps a little overblown and could maybe do without the weird hair dye. He absolutely chews his way through the scenery, injecting a little bit of fun, I think, into a gothicness that's occasionally over-serious. And for what it's worth, despite its apparently low budget, the film does play the single house location for all it's worth, with great production design and some fantastically evocative lighting. I was really impressed by the cinematography in this one. As the film progresses, the derivative Conjuring-esque stuff sort of drops away, it stops trying to be a British Blumhouse film, and the horror starts to turn again towards the weird time and space stuff, which I think on balance is a more interesting approach that opens up a lot near the end of the film. Sometimes when watching this, I had the feeling that Smith & Co. were more interested in making a artsy psychological film and were pushed into featuring more typical genre elements because they were just way less developed. It was like they didn't have as much interest from the production team in them. And unfortunately that means that it ends up feeling like an incomplete idea for a better film, perhaps, one that's wrapped up in otherwise familiar genre elements. Still, a low-budget British horror film, well-designed and executed, with interesting twists on the very well-trodden haunted house genre. If that sounds like your bag, then I'm sure you'll enjoy The Banishing. Now that's it on the movie, but there's lots of interesting stuff to discuss about it. How do you feel about portrayals of real-life parapsychologists in horror movies? Or if you're looking for a topic of discussion that's less specific, what about that kind of encroaching Conjuring-esque vibe that every horror seems to need at the moment? Let me know your opinions on that and other stuff around The Banishing in the comments below. I'd love to have a chat with you. That's it from me, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Undina Wiebow is a freelance historian living in Berlin. She's just gone through a breakup and by chance meets a new man on the same day. Oh, and she might be a water spirit. This bizarre premise is the plot of Christian Petzold's new film, a romance that takes copious inspiration from myth while telling its own story about the power of history and place. We first meet Undina at a cafe mid-breakup. She tells her ex, Johannes, that if he leaves, he will die. She takes no joy in it. She, in fact, seems to be deeply unhappy about it, but also convinced that that's what's going to happen. Then she heads off to her workplace immediately opposite and gives a talk about Berlin's history via a set of detailed architectural models. Undina, played by Paula Beer, is a striking figure with a hard-to-read expression that makes her an unpredictable central presence in the film. In part, that seems to be due to her ties to myth. Although the film studiously avoids precisely defining exactly what Undina is, she definitely has strong ties to water, and her behaviour seems to be bound by something outside of her control. Instead of these mythological elements creating a sort of genre tone, like urban fantasy, they're countered by modern touches which can almost be comedic in nature. She might be a spirit, sure, able to sentence men to death, but she also has a boring job which makes too many demands on her. When Undina returns to the cafe, Johannes is gone. The place seems almost empty. She's met there by an industrial diver, Christoph, who takes an interest in her. They're thrown together when a fish tank explodes, showering them in water and glass, an appropriately elemental meet-cute, and an introduction to a vivid romance. There's a curious sort of echoing of imagery that runs throughout Undina. The fish tank, for instance, has at its centre a figurine of a diver, and then the next scene sees Christoph in a diving suit surrounded by fish. Undina's entry to the cafe is also mimicked by Christoph in a later scene in the film, almost shot for shot. The slow pace compounds this feeling of repetition, and it gives the whole movie a sort of ethereal, transportive energy, where some kind of magical feeling is given to simple words and gestures. And then in a flash, all of that will be skewered by something silly, like somebody resuscitating someone else to the tune of "Staying Alive," muttered underneath his breath. It's not that the film is particularly a commentary on myth either. It's more about history, about the idea that stories and lives came before yours, and immensely personal, important events occurred on the ground on which you walk. If you've ever walked down the street in the flush of a new relationship and thought, has anyone walked down this street as happy as me? Then you'll understand the central theme of the film. Inevitably, that feeling doesn't last, of course. When the characters are separated, history comes back to them. And what of history? It has to be significant that in a film running under 90 minutes, there's at least 2 full speeches about Berlin architecture and lots of loving shots of those highly detailed architectural models. For the characters and for Petzold, I think, the places in which we live aren't just brick and mortar, but reflections of the lives lived in them. It's a bit hard to communicate, which is why Petzold has done such a good job here, but I'll give it a shot. In that first sequence, the breakup, Undina leaves Johannes and heads to work. While she's there, she asks a tourist during the speech to point out where they are on the model, and the camera zooms in down onto the spot, fading to an aerial view of that exact place, which happens to be the cafe Johannes is sitting in, or at least Undina's imaginary image of where he's sat. This happens a few more times as well. It's not just coincidental. Christoph looks at the model tracing the path of a river, remembering walking down it with Undina, for instance. In these moments, Petzold uses the model to reflect a kind of broad view of the world, as if it's like the bird's eye view of history, before drilling down to the personal stories beneath. It's not a dry academic point, History is a living, breathing thing in this movie. Later, in bed, Christoph asks Undina to do her talk. She gets up and walks through it, this architectural talk as foreplay, and she asks him to point out the place that she discussed. He's confused for a moment because they're at home, there's no model in sight. And then she walks into the other room, out onto the balcony, and points. She's pointing at the building that she's been describing this whole time. History isn't just a model for these people. It's not something that's created and finished firmly in the path, but it's happening here, now, around us. And without spoiling it, the third act of the film then looks back at those moments that happened between these people as they too become history. The little touches that a person can leave on a place. There's another angle to this where implicitly those moments are already there in the past for Undina, whose name Christoph finds early on graffitied on an ancient arch deep in a lake created by a dam years before. Perhaps that explains her sadness, or at least her resignation to follow the rules that she's bound by. As I said, the film runs at a lean 86 minutes and packs a lot into its runtime, aided by two beautiful central performances that burst with chemistry. Opposite Beer as Christoph is Franz Rogowski, whose simplicity and sweetness, his earnestness, complements and contrasts this withdrawn and mysterious figure in Undine. Together they bring out the best in each other, which really makes you as a filmgoer root for them and their relationship. You know, there are far too many difficult moments in Undine to call it sweet or cute, but it is a tremendously successful romance for that reason, and one packed with thought-provoking ideas communicated with deep nuance. So go and watch Undine, or sit at home and watch Undine. I really am looking forward to having a chat with you about this phenomenal movie in the comments below. And hey, in case you didn't get the memo, Indietrix now has a podcast that's being regularly updated. So if you'd like to just hear me talk about film instead of watching me do it, and also see me joined by guests and talk about wider topics in a longer context, then check out the podcast by searching Indietrix wherever you listen to your podcasts. That's it from me, but I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Godzilla.
After the doom and gloom of 2014's Godzilla, the goofy antics of Kong Skull Island, and the Saturday morning cartoon vibes of Godzilla King of the Monsters, director Adam Wingard pushes the boat out with this epic, ambitious finale to the Monsterverse canon. Here's my thoughts on the film, where I'll touch on nothing except what's shown in the trailers before getting into some major spoilers with full warnings later on. The film begins on Skull Island with Kong in captivity under close watch by Monarch. We're then quickly introduced to Bernie, Brian Tyree Henry, who's a conspiracy podcaster working in deep cover for Apex, a cybernetics company in Florida. Godzilla then suddenly attacks the city, breaking 5 years of peace out of the blue, and Bernie gets a glimpse of a strange generator in the rubble, which seems to be attracting the big guy. Nearby is Madison, Millie Bobby Brown, who seems to have not aged in the intervening 5 years since King of the Monsters. Who knows how that happens? Maybe she was in the snap. An avid listener of the podcast, she sets out with a friend, Deadpool 2's Julian Dennison, who you might recognise from any number of Taika Waititi films as well, to track down Bernie and find out more about Apex. Meanwhile, ex-Monarch scientist Nathan Lind teams up with Kong's handler, Eileen, she never really seems to have her name said out loud in the film, sorry if I didn't hear it, there's a lot going on. They get together to investigate the Hollow Earth on an expedition funded by, you guessed it, Apex. There's a lot of moving parts to the plot, but thankfully it quickly coalesces into two storylines: Kong's journey to the Hollow Earth and Madison's investigation into Apex. Both of them build on the best thing about these movies, a campy, silly tone. Now don't get me wrong, I really like Gareth Edwards' 2014 Godzilla movie. I think it's a perfect take on the shuddering terror of a kaiju, Godzilla as a natural disaster, you know, in line with the original 1954 film. But I don't think it's the only way to approach the character, and these movies are much more palatable to a wider audience because of their easier tone. Wingard fully embraces that, racking up wacky ideas and tropes and playing them off against each other. This movie in particular leans very heavily on the Hollow Earth conspiracy or fringe science tropes, and there's plenty more added to the pile besides that. Now that bright, wacky tone is reflected in the style of the film, where a rich, vibrant colour palette dominates. Secret labs are humming with green and blue fluorescent lights, pink and red neons cast a soft, hazy glow over city scenes, and Godzilla's natural electric blue, like, you know, when he charges up for his atomic breath, is contrasted with Kong's warm, sunset tones. There are also these recurrent, screen-filling chromatic rainbow flares too, which lend the action a really glossy feel, and I think they're really pretty, so that's nice too. The upshot of this is that you can also actually see the kaiju fights. I find that a common fan complaint is that too much in these movies, as well as in the Pacific Rim films, takes place in these dark, rainy scenes where there's lots of particles obscuring the action. Well, there's some of that, to be sure, here, but there's also plenty of big monster fighting in broad daylight. So don't worry, you'll get to see everyone in good detail. And about that, On the subject of big monster fighting, one of my favourite things about kaiju films in the age of computer-generated imagery is that we can finally get some proper street-level views of the chaos these big guys create. It's a perspective that I think only really CGI can actually capture. It's kind of impossible to do it properly with miniatures, suits, and stop motion. And on top of that, we actually get to see some proper kaiju fighting. You know, when watching a giant monster movie, I don't just want spectacle, I want giant monster-specific spectacle. It's not about watching them punch each other in a field somewhere. I want to see them ripping up trees and buildings to use as weapons, you know, their footsteps crushing vehicles, stuff exploding where they walk, that sort of thing. I think it's important to have action that's specific to the characters and settings that it takes place in. And the same is true, for instance, of superhero movies, where you want to see, as an audience member, creative and specific uses of superpowers, not just harder hitting punches. And all of that leads quite nicely to the first fight between Godzilla and Kong. This is pretty heavily covered in the trailers, but if you're really strict about spoilers, now is probably the time to stop watching and come back when you've seen the movie. And to help with that, you know, why not subscribe to the channel now? Click the bell even to get a notification when the next video comes out. Think of it as a little treat to yourself, because it will certainly be a treat for me. Okay, so to set the scene, Kong is being shipped to Antarctica when Godzilla gets wind of him and arrives in the middle of the ocean to mess stuff up. He destroys a few ships and jets casually with a single swipe of his tail. It's another great reminder of his scale and the scope of these fights. He then immediately capsizes the ship that Kong is tied to. This first fight taking place at sea gives Godzilla a natural advantage, and that's a nice dynamic because it justifies the mismatch of powers a lot better than the usual my monster is better than yours type stuff. And that means we have a bit of an insight into what they're actually doing in the fight, because sure enough, once he's free, Kong immediately jumps ship to stand on a nearby aircraft carrier. It's the widest, flattest surface around, and so it gives him a bit more of an even playing field. This sort of writing is a clever way to approach a fundamentally dumb thing. Never compromise on what the audience wants, which is, to be clear, for the big monkey to fight the big lizard, but do think about the natural abilities and characteristics of your fighters and work them in interesting ways. We see a bit more of this later on, so hold on to that thought for now. With the advantage on Godzilla's side, Kong is roundly defeated, and they have to airlift him the rest of the way to the Monarch base at Antarctica. As an aside, this is one of what I think is several apparent references to the 1962 original film, which this is not based on, but obviously draws some inspiration from. And that movie, of course, is King Kong vs. Godzilla. In that film, there's also a lot of scenes where Kong is tied to a boat and scenes where he's airlifted as well. He's a bit more graceful in this movie. If you're interested in finding out more about that film, which is the first time where these two fought each other, check out my video on the subject, linked in the description and here in the video as well. On arrival, the gang head into Hollow Earth, where a very surprising reference to 2001: A Space Odyssey occurs. Who knew you'd be getting that in a kaiju movie in the 21st century? And this is also where we probably begin to get into spoiler territory proper. So here's the big spoiler warning. Long pause, and now you've been properly warned. Spoilers ahead. Hollow Earth is a tremendously fun setting that's been teased several times throughout these films, starting with Skull Island. It's perhaps the dumbest idea in a franchise about giant monsters. It's the concept that a whole ecosystem thrives in the center of the Earth, accessible by tunnels to the surface. So this film has a lot of fun with some of the problems of that idea, most notably how gravity works in that context, which, as it turns out, is something to do with a bizarre glowing crystal available in abundance there. Sounds like it might be plot important. On arrival to the Hollow Earth, we get a few sweeping looks at this lusciously realised location. It's a fantastical Jurassic landscape where, instead of a sky, the land curves back around overhead. The ground glows with those crystals, the air is full of pterodactyls, and after a moment of silence, the first gigantic creature shows up and Kong gets to fighting. This, as it turns out, is a whole ecosystem of titans, complete with scuttling crab monsters getting eaten by giant Gila lizards. It's a tremendous sequence, capped by Kong entering into this gigantic, cathedral-like Gothic space that's littered with skeletons from the war between his species and Godzilla's. He finds an axe there, apparently carved from the backplates of another of Godzilla's kind, which is incomparably cool, and he takes his place on a rough-hewn throne. This is such a fun idea that I think it's actually just worth pausing at. It's Kong, finally and definitively a king, reclaiming his rightful throne. Very fun stuff. Back on the surface, Madison, Bernie, and Josh have uncovered the secret plan that Apex is working on, Mecha Godzilla. Powered by a severed head of Ghidorah, it's remotely controlled by his other surviving head, which has a human inside it. Another great idea that shows the thoughtful consistency of writing here. I think that's an incredibly important thing when writing something this gleefully dumb. Those sorts of callbacks and inventive attention to detail, just like Kong sitting on his throne, make for great pulpy stuff that's also immensely satisfying, as much as it is silly. So stuck in a cavernous, shadowy testing facility, Madison and co are shocked when Mechagodzilla finally arrives. I really love this design. He's pleasingly blocky, covered in these kind of sci-fi gewgaws and doodads, but he's also somewhat skeletal. He's definitely spooky, but he runs out of power quickly. As it turns out, they need those plot crystals from Hollow Earth. Who'da thunk it? All of this builds to yet another Godzilla vs. Kong fight, this time in the extravagantly neon-lit Hong Kong, which of course turns into a freeway brawl between them and Mechagodzilla. I'd rather not recap the whole thing, but it's worth noting again that Wingard and co think carefully about the details on this fight, so that the spectacle feels a bit more justified. On firm ground and with a weapon, because yay, opposable thumbs, Kong is more of a threat to Godzilla here, and he nimbly dodges behind and also climbs skyscrapers, which means he's using his natural agility to his advantage. It's not the most clever stuff in the world, it's not going to shake the foundations of storytelling, but it's basic justification for why the fights go differently, and a lot more consistent than the 1962 movie's original arsepull, where King Kong gets lightning powers in the third act, apparently out of nowhere. As I said before, I think this is a really important thing in blockbuster writing. You can have the most stupid plot, setting, and characters, but you have to write intelligently to present those circumstances to an audience in a way that has impact. The movie ends with King Kong and Godzilla squaring up to each other, then deciding they're cool. Brothers in arms. I love it. I'm a sucker for that stuff. As much as the Monsterverse pays lip service to this grand overarching plan, a design that links all of the films together, the real idea behind it is just to have big monkey fight big lizard. And that's clear right from the opening title sequence, where the fights in previous movies are displayed in a sort of tournament bracket style, leading up to this matchup between Godzilla and Kong. Those apparently epic and intricate plot designs are really kind of self-effacing in that respect. They're just window dressing to build up exactly why it's so important to have these big guys hit each other. It's definitely possible to have this work alongside actual human drama. Again, Gareth Edwards' 2014 Godzilla film certainly manages that, but it's absolutely not necessary. It's a sort of storytelling device, I think, a double meaning that will be familiar to fans of wrestling or superhero comics, where convoluted continuity and huge character conflicts are similarly just in service of the fights, more present for their own hype than any ultimate payoff. So yes, as you might expect from the title, Godzilla vs. Kong is a big, dumb action movie. But it also displays the canniest sort of blockbuster filmmaking, giving an audience exactly what they want while fashioning intelligible motivations and ideas around it with a healthy helping of visual panache. And hey, it's big monkey fights big lizard. What's not to love? That's it on Godzilla vs. Kong, but I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Too much crash bang, not enough human drama? Missing Mothra? Let's have a chat about it. And hey, if you're interested in hearing more on films, then check out the indietrix podcast, available wherever you listen to your podcasts. Links are in the description. Have a good one, and bye for now.
We're lucky to be alive.
Whoa, stop! Don't come any closer.
It's a girl.
Girl! Oh my gosh, girl. I'm sorry.
No, move on here.
I've just never seen a girl before.
Who are you?
In the distant future, New World is populated by settlers struggling with something bizarre, the noise, a phenomena where men's thoughts, and only men, manifest around them, audible to those nearby. This harsh world is disrupted by the arrival of a girl from space, which sends protagonist Todd on a journey across New Earth. Based on Patrick Ness's very popular sci-fi series, Chaos Walking was optioned in a wave of Hollywood interest in young adult sci-fi after the phenomenal success of Hunger Games. Since then, it's had a bit of a checkered production history. After an original pass at the script by Charlie Kaufman, no less, was cast aside, the film was originally shot back in 2017, only to garner very bad responses from test audiences. That, coupled with an executive reshuffle, led to extensive reshoots in early 2019, with original director Doug Liman replaced by Evil Dead and Don't Breathe director Fede Alvarez. So the film that's arrived to audiences is basically no one's first choice. But is it any good? I wonder if you can tell where this is going. The movie opens with Todd, Tom Holland, living in Prentisstown, a small settlement named for its charismatic mayor, Mads Mikkelsen. The mayor exerts a hold over Todd and the rest of the town that's only resisted by Ben and Killian, Todd's adopted fathers. There are no women in the town for reasons that remain unclear. That changes when Viola, Daisy Ridley, crash lands, the last survivor of a scouting party from a new settler ship. The mayor sends his troops to get her, and Todd flees with her, aiming for a nearby settlement. Like tons of YA books, there are some familiar tropes here, particularly the discover the truth about your corrupt world plotline and the teens with special abilities characters. But that central device, the noise, is a really fascinating one, and it's one which differs massively between the book and its movie adaptation. In the novel and its sequels, the noise that men create is purely audio, a clever conceit that meshes with the interior narrative voice of characters. I mean, think about it. As you're reading a book, you're imagining the voices of its characters, and then you're running the actual action alongside that in your head as well. So intrusive sounds, or noise, is way less difficult to deal with. There's also some stylistic devices that can really help there. In some printings of the book, characters' noise is shown differently. It's like misaligned or it's overlapping on the page, and that really helps to differentiate it. On screen, the noise is interpreted as also being visual. It manifests as a sort of multicolored fog, or like a nebula, I suppose, around the head. This fog can also be used to create more tangible images, like the echoes of memories or wholly created images invented by the imagination of the thinker. Now that's a good adaptational move, I think, and every intentional use of the noise is pretty well thought through. There are examples of characters using the noise to fool other characters, creating things that aren't there, and chase sequences take on a surreal tone when the pursuer is surrounded by echoes, memories of the person that they're chasing. But not every use is fully intentional. For consistency's sake, crowd scenes take place amongst a hubbub of speaking from a mix of different voices, as multiple people's noise mixes together. That definitely makes sense, but it also makes plenty of scenes annoying as hell to watch, and occasionally it's borderline incomprehensible. And it's not a small issue we're talking about here, it's the central plot device of the whole film. So if you find it distracting in the first 5 minutes, then whoops, sorry, you're going to be annoyed for the entire runtime. I also think this is something that might have come across better in cinemas, although cinemas still aren't open in the UK, so I haven't been able to see it like that. Of course, things being as they are, precious few people are going to see this in a cinema, and so it really is a big problem for the movie. Once the characters actually leave Prentisstown, this problem drops back a bit, as it's just Todd and Viola on their own. And of course, Viola has no noise of her own because she's a woman, so you're just listening to Todd's noise and seeing his thoughts. And then unfortunately, another worse problem rears its head. The characters. Todd's arc in the film is arguably his emergence from the brainwashing of the mayor and coming to understand the truth about his world. That means that for most of the film, he's kind of a dick. Again, you can get away with that in a novel where you have an insight into the mind of the characters, how they really feel about things, and you get to know them a bit better through that. In a film, you just don't have that luxury, and so you're spending time with an unlikable, childish character, and he's your lead. I'm not at all opposed to unlikable characters, but you definitely need to be careful about how you write them. One good solution is to surround them with likable characters, people who we have a bit more of an insight into, who have enjoyable habits and their own motivations. A good example of this is The Hunger Games, which I think does a really great job there. If you think about it, Katniss Everdeen is actually pretty difficult to like. We know that she's brave, so we want to follow her because her first act in the film is one of self-sacrifice, but she does spend a lot of her time moping and yelling. It's understandable, but it's not much fun. So instead of just having her on screen, we also have the roguish Hamish, the prim Effie, the scheming Seneca, and so on. In Chaos Walking, most of Todd's screen time is shared with Viola, who by nature of the story is basically an unknown quantity. She slowly opens up over the course of the film, but that means lots of the middle of the movie is saddled with scenes of an unlikable protagonist and a boring one wandering around the woods. And that's a shame, because it coincides with the plot beginning to slow down as well. Now, this is a bit speculative, but I think this is where the big changes in reshoots took place. I haven't read the book, but chatting it through with my partner who has, and reading online, the film has a very different third act to the book. There's also a significant character in the second act of the novel who's cast in the film and had scenes actually shot, but is absent entirely from the final cut. The upshot of all that is that just when your interest in the film is dropping off due to the bland protagonists, what should be an exciting ending is actually the most edges filed off section of the movie. It's real committee think stuff. You know, thinking back on the film, there's clearly supposed to be a message about toxic masculinity and the way that charismatic leaders can distort your worldview packed in there somewhere. But a few choices in the making of the movie seem to be directly aimed at making that theme less impactful. In the book, the horrible truth about Prenticetown is actually told outright to the men of the town once they reach a certain age, which if you think about it, makes them complicit in it. No such dynamic is mentioned in the film, although from a few early mentions from Todd of becoming a man, it seems like there might have been something there about it before the reshoots. And the mayor's control of the town, initially kind of ambiguous, seems here to be more like mind control, judging from some scenes later on in the movie. And that means that the bad things the men do under his control are to some extent not their fault, because he's coercing them into action rather than convincing them. It's changes like this that make me wonder why the people behind the project wanted to make the film. I mean, money, of course, but this delayed release and lack of advertising has led to the film flopping pretty badly. It made just $17 million at the box office against its $100 million budget. So that didn't really work out, did it? Instead, you might imagine that they were interested in the message of the story, but in reality, they went about weakening it just about as much as possible, so they can't care that much about it either. I just don't get it. Why make these movies? You know, the mind just boggles at that. Chaos Walking isn't the worst YA movie I've seen, but it's certainly near the bottom of the pile. On the continuum of post-Hunger Games rushed YA sci-fi movies, of which, you know, if you think about it, there really is a disturbingly large amount, it's somewhere above The Giver and somewhere underneath Maze Runner 1. YA tier list when, I hear you ask? Never. So that's Chaos Walking, where the biggest crime is making, to be honest, a mess of a really interesting premise. But I'd love to hear your thoughts about the movie in the comments below. Did you like the books? Are you terrified to watch this? I really hope you avoid it, to be honest, if you like the books. I'd rather you didn't put yourself through that kind of pain. And if you've got any thoughts about that, but you don't want to say them in the comments, but for some reason you want to contact me on other social media, why not hit me up on Twitter? I'm at Will Webful, and also indietrix has its own handle. Don't forget too that the podcast is being regularly updated, so if you're interested in listening to more film content instead of watching it, then check out the podcast, which is under indietrix wherever you get your podcasts. That's it from me. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. It's 1665 and a plague is sweeping England, bringing with it paranoia, fear and witch hunts. All of which gets a bit close to home when Grace has to bury her husband after he dies of the plague. After an altercation with her landlord, Squire Pendleton, Grace is accused of being a witch, and Judge John Moorcroft, a famously violent witch hunter, is brought in to prosecute her case.
Nobody's safe.
The Reckoning is another horror film made by a UK director best known for his cult noughties horrors, so it's a lot like the also very similarly named The Banishing, and yes, I have confused them on my release date calendar a few times. In the case of The Reckoning, the director is Neil Marshall, best known for The Descent and for Dog Soldiers, and he's also helmed quite a lot of the big set-piece Game of Thrones episodes. I really like Marshall's early films. I think The Descent in particular is a really imaginative and a deeply uncomfortable horror film, and Dog Soldiers is also sorely underrated. Unfortunately, I think he's gone off the boil a bit. I didn't review it a couple of years ago, but if you've seen the most recent Hellboy remake, then you'll know that it's pretty dire, to be honest. It's really not a good movie, and I unfortunately have to tell you that The Reckoning is kind of more of the same. The intro is actually pretty good to this movie. There's this kind of black and white shot of bodies being emptied into a mass grave, and there's this text reel that tells you about the pressures on society at the time, all quite potent stuff. And you see a woman being pulled from her house by witch hunters. There's a child there who we later find out to be Grace. And then we meet Grace, you know, she's crying over a letter that her husband's written her, she goes outside and she has to bury him. It's this really powerful, emotional scene, there's not much dialogue in it, but there's quite a lot of music. And before I realised, there was about 8 minutes where they were just slowly setting up what's happened in this really overdramatic sort of music video-y way. And unfortunately, that's the tone that the whole film goes with. And this is where we meet the protagonist, which is Grace, played by Charlotte Kirk. Now, this is Kirk's first lead role in a movie. She's done a couple of bit parts here and there. She also co-wrote this film with Marshall, who she's engaged to. She's doing quite good in this opening sequence where she's showing these big emotions and there's not much dialogue, and you're thinking, yeah, this is good. This is a good way of approaching this. I mean, maybe just like tone it back just a wee bit, but it seems acceptable. And then after 10 minutes of it, you want the film to kind of change gears and go somewhere else. So we get the first proper dialogue scene when the squire arrives on the scene, the guy who owns the right to her property, and says, you know, if you haven't got the plague and you're still alive in a week, I need your money or we're going to kick you out with your baby. And like I said, this is the first proper bit of dialogue that we get, like an actual extended conversation taking place between two human beings that isn't intercut like a music video and doesn't have a huge amount of music played underneath it. And it's immediately apparent that the script is pretty rough. There's a dialogue problem that you often see in films like this, in period movies, where the characters from the olden days speak like it's the olden days. And there can be good ways of doing it. I think The Favourite is a good example, where they're talking in this register of language that's quite old-fashioned. But there are bad ways of doing it, where you make them stiff and you don't really feel like they're having normal conversations. It's not quite like privy be thine, pay me the rent type stuff, but it's only a couple of steps off. And what's maybe a bit weirder about it is that it's a little inconsistent, because here and there these anachronistic turns of phrases like moron and stuff like that show up. These words that feel a bit more modern and don't really fit into that setting. So faced with this pretty rough script, I think certain actors and certain performance styles can work. And I think you can make, like I said, these kind of mannered period voices into something consistent and coherent. But the film does not do that. And it's not helped by the fact that, judging from just this one performance that she's done, Charlotte Kirk is not good. She's not a good actor. She's very wooden in her delivery, and although she can do the big emotional beats in a believable way, she doesn't seem to have much range. And the unfortunate truth is that the dialogue doesn't give her enough opportunity to really shine, and the story arc that her character goes on is so flat that she actually doesn't get to show off much range. But again, it's hard to know who to blame there, because she also co-wrote the script. So if she sat there thinking this dialogue isn't good and that she has to go and deliver it as a not good actor, then I just think that's on her and on Neil Marshall. Sorry. The movie really suffers because of its protagonist's poor performance. So at this point, like I said, we're about 10 minutes into the movie. We've got the rough kind of backstory set up. We know the squire is trying to pressure her to move out of that place. We know there's all this paranoia and witch hunts bubbling underneath the film. And I was thinking, okay, well, this is going to be an interesting kind of next 45 minutes to an hour where they're building up the tension. But no, they don't really do that. The squire goes straight to the pub and says, I think she's a witch. And everyone around them just agrees and says, yes, Grace does seem like a witch. And then they go and they put her in jail. And then the movie just stays there for the next hour and 10 minutes. Now, I've said before that for me as a critic, I really don't want to make a review about how I think the movie should have been, but it's pretty hard to watch a film that's ostensibly a horror, or at least a sort of like, I guess a kind of thriller, depending on how you want to interpret the supernatural themes of the film. It's hard to watch a movie like that and not think that it should do stuff like slowly build up its tension, or have some kind of dynamic change, some kind of raising of the stakes. And the fact is when your protagonist has been like put in a cell and tortured about 30 minutes into the film, you haven't got much room to grow narratively. And that ends up being the biggest problem of the movie, I think, even more so than the weak central performance. Pretty much immediately following Grace being put in that cell, Moorcroft, the witch hunter, arrives, and then the film settles into this, unfortunately, I mean, kind of comfortable rut. And it's weird to call something that's basically kind of torture porn comfortable, and yet that's what it is. There's like this cycle of events that happens over and over again in the film's runtime, where it's like Grace gets chucked in the cell, the witch hunter has some weird conversation with his acolyte, he tortures her, she goes back into the cell, has a vision, and then we just repeat. I should say that the film is also pretty clearly quite cheap. You know, most of what occurs in the movie happens either in Grace's house, in the tavern, in this big kind of torture room, or in the cell that she's stuck in. And to an extent, that kind of limits them on what they can do, but there are ways to work around that. And unfortunately, that's good writing, good character work, and ratcheting up the tension, none of which the film seems interested in doing. You know, it's weird, there's all these clever ideas in the film that are close to being something cool, and they just don't develop them. Sean Pertwee, bless him, is trying to do his best with this Moorcroft character, and he's kind of trying to layer him and be like, my God, I know I'm doing bad things, but I'm doing them because I'm such a pious man. Do they develop that? No, not really. And so what we basically get is this cycle of Grace gets tortured, Grace gets chucked in her cell, Grace has a vision, and we loop back around again. And I should say that there's lots of violence happening in and amongst this as well. You know, these apparently real tortures that were used on women during this kind of horrific period. And also a lot of like punitive stripping of Grace. There's a lot of like ripping off her clothes and putting her in the cell. And all of that stuff is really uncomfortable. It doesn't feel like focused. It feels verging on misogynistic. I know that they're portraying a misogyny from the characters, but it does feel gratuitous, which makes it doubly weird that she co-wrote the film. So to some extent, she signed off on all of that stuff. Yeah, really strange and not very nice choices. And ultimately not impactful. This was an issue that happened with Hellboy, and that I was willing to kind of chalk up to executive interference, of which there was quite a lot of documented interference on that film, where in a lot of the, what I imagine are reshoots for Hellboy, they just added in loads of extra gore, and it doesn't really fit in the story narratively, it doesn't really fit in the tone of the film either. And this is that, you know, there's these like, just out of nowhere, these very violent images in an otherwise pretty psychological focus, and it just doesn't really gel into anything. And to be clear, I think all of this stuff could work. You know, they could focus more on Grace's character arc, except there isn't really one, or they could focus on the kind of tension and raising the stakes, but they're already pretty high when the movie basically kicks off, so it's hard to know where they would go from there. And of course, the other thing that could improve the film is if Charlotte Kirk's performance was better, which it just isn't. You know, she's fundamentally not that believable in the real depths of the emotional stuff. It always feels a little bit surface level, which is ironic because her other problem as an actor is that she doesn't really have any like mid performance range. She either does like I'm being quiet in the scene, a kind of 0, or she does a full-on screaming and yelling like 100, and there's nothing in between, which means the film feels like you're just flipping between these extremes all the time. And just to kind of round off my thoughts on the film, I'm sitting here thinking, who is this for? Like, what's the point of this film? If it's supposed to be a horror, then I think it fails because I don't think there's much that's scary in the film. If it's supposed to be a psychological thriller that has kind of horror trappings, then I think that fails too because it's not got deep enough characters and kind of motivations for those people. I can't be guessing at what they're trying to do or how they feel about what's going on if the scripts and the performances aren't there. And if the idea is for this to be a sort of eye-opening record of the very real horrors that were enacted on women during this period, then I think it fails because of the inaccuracies in its dialogue and in its plotting. Because for all that we see these really vivid and vicious tortures that happen to Grace, she's perfectly fine to run around and do all sorts of like athletic stuff in the finale of the movie. Besides, if that's something that you want to see, then I think there's already a very good film that covers that, which is 1968's Witchfinder General, starring Vincent Price in a rare, serious role. If this was something I was watching at home and it wasn't for a review, I wouldn't have finished watching it past about the first 45-50 minutes. Yeah, it's a rough one. I think that most films that get to this point of like actually being distributed and released and sold for actual money aren't completely terrible, and there are some good touches in the film. And I actually think the cinematography is very good. The cinematographer is called Luke Bryant. He hasn't made very many feature films. He's quite like an early career DOP, and I think he does a lot here with very little money, which also means very little time on a film like this. You know, I'm sure this was shot pretty quickly, but I think he really manages to pull a significantly like punching above its weight look with the film. And that's pretty much what I'm going to say that I like about it, unfortunately. So that's it from me on The Reckoning, but I'd love to hear your thoughts about this movie in the comments below. If you've seen it, then let's have a chat. And if you just want to talk about how you wish Neil Marshall was making good horror movies again, then we can talk about that too. And don't forget to check out the indietrix podcast if you haven't yet, because there's lots of fun conversations happening about film in a more long form, no video format there, so you can check those out. You can find it wherever you listen to your podcasts. Just search for indietrix. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Play me.
Hello, Detective Banks. Do you know where your officers are?
Detective Zeke Banks, Chris Rock. is a maverick working undercover to take down gangs. But when yet another copycat killer, apparently inspired by the Jigsaw murders, starts to target Zeke and his colleagues in the pretty corrupt police department, Zeke must take on a new rookie partner to investigate the murders and catch the killer before it's too late. I remember loving the original Saw movie like any proper 14-year-old and being slowly more and more disappointed with its sequels. In fact, I didn't really realise how many sequels there were. When I was watching this, I was thinking, yeah, I've seen most of these movies, right? I've seen Saw 1 to 4, but no, I think that's like half of the movies, which seems like a wild amount of films to spin off from a pretty limited central concept. Now, the first Saw movie, if you remember it, has two kind of key creatives behind it, one of which is Lee Wannell, God, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, who's more well known for stuff like Upgrade now. And of course the other is James Wan, who's a multi-million-dollar horror kind of brand and a broader filmmaker in his own right. That first Saw movie still feels quite tight, I think. It's very much of its time in terms of how it looks and how it's paced, but it is a very tight idea, which is essentially this kind of bottle story, these two people trapped in a room with these increasingly nasty kind of things they have to cope with, and then on the other side of it, a kind of police thriller where these guys are trying to work out where these dudes are and kind of save them before whatever happens to them happens. And that whole structure is really a way for a pretty fundamentally cheap movie to punch above its weight, and it worked. It kickstarted this massive franchise. Unfortunately, the rest of the films in the franchise really focused in on that kind of torture porn element of the film, which meant that they had these increasingly inward-facing kind of conversations about the story. And so every film became 5 or so people are stuck in a series of really Byzantine, odd kind of traps that don't really seem to have any reflection of the characters or the actual work that would be involved in them, and instead are just about delivering thrills to an audience that doesn't really care about these kind of central, pretty nasty characters. And of course there had to be a twist ending with a kind of convoluted, oh, it was like this all along kind of montage that increasingly made very little sense and felt disconnected from the story. And on top of that, you know, every killer had to either be Jigsaw, who died like 2 movies in, or a copycat killer. And I think if you count Spiral's killer, then this is like the 5th Jigsaw killer, the kind of copycat version of Jigsaw, which means this guy has this irrepressibly seductive political philosophy, apparently, that everyone just wants to get behind. So those movies made less and less sense, and I think they got to a point where there was kind of decadence, you know, you knew exactly what you were going to get. It was like Baroque music when it fell apart, when there were only so many progressions you could make from different chords. And Spiral is sort of a soft reboot. It's an attempt to think more creatively about the Saw franchise, and you can see that positioning in the title, which doesn't have Saw or Jigsaw or anything in the title. It's Spiral from the Book of Saw, which is a slightly grand and maybe cinematic universe-y way of saying, hey, we're doing a soft reboot for the Saw movies. So when I say it's a soft reboot, I mean you have a new central protagonist, Chris Rock, and you also have a different focus for the movie. Because what's interesting here is that they've really picked up from that first movie the police procedural elements and gone back to that. So instead of following the people who are kind of within the traps in this, you're largely following Chris Rock's character trying to investigate a series of killings. So instead of being stuck in this kind of blue-tinged warehouse full of these kind of clockwork traps, which really make no sense about how much work would have been put into them, it's really a full-time job, I think, being a Jigsaw killer, you instead get a couple of those traps, don't get me wrong, and they're still kind of dumb in how they're built, but you also have like an actual world where there are characters kind of talking to each other, and there are locations where normal people are going about their everyday lives, which gives a bit more of a contrast, a bit more of a pace to the film. The opening of the film pretty handily kind of puts that to the audience as a proposition for how this movie is going to go, because it starts off with a cop chasing someone into the sewers and then getting caught up in a kind of Saw trap. So you get this kind of police procedural moment where it's someone going after someone who's I think stolen a purse or something like that at the start of the movie, and then you get this very like Saw type filmmaking, which is like over edited, has speed ramps and that blue tinged bleach bypass look in the subway kind of tunnels below. So you get to see a proposition where they're saying, look, it's going to be a police procedural, but it has Saw elements to it, and that's what we're going to do. So it's a new direction for the Saw franchise, but is it any good? Somewhat. Let's just say that the lack of subtlety in Saw's writing is still very much on display here, and it is pretty much the same creative team behind the film. It's just got a different kind of focus to it. So we first meet Chris Rock's character, and he's just doing like a Chris Rock stand-up bit, and this is something that recurs throughout the film, where there's just chunks where Chris Rock will just deliver like a long spiel of kind of comedy bit just in between these kind of death traps. That's really the structure of the movie until they decide it has to be a bit more dramatic about halfway through. And this new police procedural element is actually about as generic as police procedural stuff can get. You know, you'll be watching these scenes kind of amazed at how carefully they've cribbed all of the police language from other movies. There's bits of Training Day, there's bits of Seven, and the first time we see Chris Rock kind of after being undercover, you know, as an actual police officer, he's literally having a shouting match with his chief about how he's a maverick, how he doesn't want a partner, how she's partnered him up with a rookie, and she's saying stuff like, as you know, because your dad was the chief of the department for years, and you have to put all this trauma behind you, this very basic expository chat. It really is as generic as it comes, even though it is kind of a new flavour for the Saw franchise. So Rock settles into this kind of groove of there being a murder, them finding the body, and then following some clues, along with his partner, who's played by Max Mignella. And you also get a kind of blink and you miss it performance from Samuel L. Jackson, who plays Chris Rock's dad in the film. Rock, bless him, is not a great dramatic actor, I think, and in this film he's certainly not doing his best. There's a lot of overacting, whether that's the kind of I'm grizzled stuff, or whether that's the like deep emotional stuff that happens in the film. And of course it doesn't help that he's playing quite a generic character. You know, we get very little idea about what he's like, apart from all the stuff that you normally have in a cop thing anyway. The closest thing he gets to proper characterization, weirdly, is something that I see in a lot of police procedurals, which is that for some reason he drives like a custom muscle car. All the other cops are in squad cars and he's like, I've got my custom muscle car. And his dad also has a custom like cherry red muscle car, which is just like, I don't know, it's trying to set your character up as cool without doing any work around it. You're just like, he's got a cool car. As for the kind of typical Saw elements, there's the normal overblown traps, the overcomplicated, semi-related to what the person did wrong but not really traps. And there's also a new puppet, the kind who delivers the ultimatums and the little creepy video messages. I'm always struck in these movies about how much work goes into being a serial killer like Jigsaw. They're making really high-level bespoke mechanical stuff, and they must own like a lot of warehouses, because there's 3 or 4 different warehouses where people get kind of put into a death trap or something like that. And I just don't believe that you could squat on a property like that and still build something of that level in it. And are they making these puppets, or are they like artist commissions? If I was investigating the Jigsaw murders, my first lead would be going into like the bespoke puppetry artisan district of this city where Saw takes place, which must have a district of that kind because of the amount of puppetry work that's going in. Has anyone been commissioned to make like a demonic pig puppet? Because we need to know if you have. Please tell the police if you get any new puppetry commissions. And there really isn't much more to say about Spiral from the Book of Saw that isn't a spoiler, but I'll leave that to you because that's such an inherent part of the Saw franchise, you know, the weird twists that come along the way. I think the biggest thing in Spiral's favour is the fact that it really does try to rethink the Saw franchise a bit. It tries to step outside of this, a couple of people get stuck in a room and have to hurt each other in increasingly weird ways thing that the franchise really got stuck on. You know, that's a cool story and you can certainly do some stuff with it, but can you do 8 movies with it without repeating yourself? No, not really. It's what happens when a franchise becomes inward looking, you know, it starts to eat itself. Just ask Star Wars. In Spiral, they've done a good attempt to kind of refocus the film into something that has a couple more ideas, some outside influence coming in. It's not fully successful because the films that they are drawing from, they are really drawing from, they're being very derivative with, but it's at least a start. And it says a lot that this movie is only 90 minutes long and it did entertain me for that runtime, albeit, you know, it didn't really draw me in. It knows what it is, it's this schlocky police procedural that has these significant horror elements to it, and it just about manages to make that work. It certainly zips along and fills its runtime. If I was a teacher and this was homework that had been given to me, I would say, some improvement, needs more work, see me after class. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this film in the comments below. So let's have a chat. How do you feel about the Saw franchise? Do you think this is moving away from all that stuff that you like? These weird death traps that Jigsaw and, you know, the rest of the copycats are able to do? Love to hear your thoughts, so let's have a chat. Have a good one, and bye for now.
There's $200 million in the vault beneath the Strip, with a 32-hour window to get it out. Find the safe. This should be a simple in and out.
Scott is one of a hardened group of survivors who made it out of Las Vegas after it fell to a zombie outbreak. But just a few years later, he's working as a fry cook when casino boss Tanaka offers him the heist of a lifetime. Sneak into Las Vegas before it's nuked and empty a vault of $200 million. Army of the Dead is the new film from cult director Zack Snyder. And it feels a bit strange calling him a cult director, I know, because he's so well known for blockbuster movies, these multi-million-dollar franchise films. But it feels strange to call him anything other than a cult director, because I don't think there's any other director alive who gets talked about as much on the internet by as vocal and occasionally as aggressive a fan base as Snyder's. And that's all, of course, to do with the Snyder Cut, the feeling that Snyder got robbed of the ability to do what he wanted to do with the DC universe. But before all of that, in fact before superheroes entirely, Snyder wrote a script as a proposed sequel to his 2004 Dawn of the Dead remake, and then Warner Brothers just sat on it for years and years, until 2019, when before the Snyder Cut was officially confirmed, Snyder got to make his zombie movie. It's also notable as being only the second original film that Snyder's made, one that isn't adapted from another IP. And I think the word original is doing a lot of heavy lifting there, because actually the idea of combining these zombie and heist movie genres together makes for quite a derivative film, albeit one that's very entertaining and has a distinctive visual style. And that's actually where I'd like to start with talking about this movie, because you really notice it right from the beginning moments. The film has this odd sort of creamy, very dreamy look to it, where it's all shot incredibly shallow, very little in focus, and what is in focus is pin sharp. And that's because it was predominantly shot on a lens known as the Canon Dream lens. It's a 50mm lens that has an f/0.95 aperture, which, if you know about cameras and lenses, means it's incredibly shallow. And all of this would have been especially at the forefront of Snyder's mind because he shot this movie. So he's not just the credited writer, director, and producer, but also the cinematographer on this film as well. Now, I don't think they use this lens on everything, like they have slightly implied in the kind of publicity and the marketing around the film, because you can see in some of the behind the scenes stuff that there seems to be different lenses being used. But nevertheless, it is obviously used in several signature moments throughout the movie. In fact, this particular shot behind me, I'm pretty sure, was shot with that particular lens. And the end result of that technical mumbo jumbo is that it's got a very creamy look, by which I mean that it's relatively low contrast. It has kind of an oddly desaturated whites, so skin tones and kind of mid elements of the image are often quite desaturated, but the colors are very rich because of the way that the film footage itself has been treated. And so that, combined with these kind of rainbow lens flares and the aforementioned very shallow focus, really makes the film kind of dreamy and almost surreal looking. You get a very good look at that in the opening minutes of the film, which sees a US Army convoy transporting some sort of secret stuff, which turns out to be basically OG Zombie Patient Zero, and they are derailed by, let's say, an particularly poorly judged episode of vehicular oral. Once that zombie escapes, we get this lovely shot of him silhouetted against the bright lights of Vegas, and we realise he's going to head to the nearest population centre and do his thing. And then there's a hard cut to a Liberace impersonator who talks to the camera for a second before starting to play the piano as people get eaten behind him. And that's the second thing I want to talk about, which is the really odd tone of this movie. Odd isn't necessarily a bad thing, it's just that there is a really weird mishmash of very dark humour, attempts to do kind of serious human character stuff and even touch on some political things, and then just this kind of like comic booky violence and gore. Being a Zack Snyder opening sequence, this is like a poppy montage set to a popular song, and it has lots and lots of slow motion in it, so for you Snyder purists, you'll be happy. And what we're looking at, set to a Richard Cheese cover, which again is another callback to Dawn of the Dead, the 2004 movie that very famously had a Richard Cheese musical montage in it. What we're seeing in this sequence is nothing less than the fall of Las Vegas. We see showgirls running around biting patrons on the casino floor with the slot machines. We see Elvis impersonators shambling around on the strip. If you've seen the trailer, you'll be familiar with the sequence because it's been very heavily featured in those videos. And then we start to get these survivor stories where we see characters who later become the main cast of the film kind of making their way out of Las Vegas. And sometimes these are intercut with those survivors holding a family photo and standing in front of a photographic backdrop, like one that's been properly rigged, like something that you would see at like school picture day or something, but it's been set up in the middle of this kind of smouldering wreckage, this bloody carnage. And then after all this kind of knockabout comedy meta stuff, there's a really sad, melancholic beat. And that's where the film's opening montage ends and Army of the Dead begins proper. So that gives you a really on-the-nose example of how odd the tone of the film can be. But when it works, I think it works really well. It's really singular. And the funny thing was, it reminded me of a particular franchise, probably because Las Vegas also features in an installment of that franchise, which is Fallout. Now, Fallout has that same thing where it's having these really dark little vignettes, but it's also touching them with these elements of almost absurd humor. And the closest I think that Army of the Dead gets to that exact tone is a moment when, later on, when they're in the Strip, they find a load of bodies hanging from the ceiling. These people who obviously killed themselves to not be zombies, but they're all wearing glittery late-era Elvis jumpsuits. So they're obviously a whole room full of Elvis impersonators who shut themselves away and decided they'd rather die than become zombies. Pretty tough idea, but kind of darkly gallows humor funny. And like I said, that's not always an easy tone to watch, and I think that the human drama elements of the film are probably the ones that suffer the most. Kind of like the stuff that really didn't work in Batman vs Superman, you know, the whole Martha thing, this parental drama stuff. But for what it's worth, it really does feel like a departure from the very doomy, gloomy, funereal, if that doesn't sound too ironic, in a movie called Of the Dead, tone that Snyder did in his superhero movies. It really is a lot more fun, I think, on the surface than Justice League or Man of Steel or Batman vs Superman. So with an absolute laser focus and I think an almost admirably like workmanlike quality, Snyder quickly gets right into the meat of the film. We set up the heist in the scene after the montage, so getting right into it, no need for normal life or whatever, and then we get into an assembling the team kind of heist section. Now what you want to do in a heist movie is have a team of recognizable characters who all have their own little quirks, their motivations, and importantly the skills that they're going to bring to the heist. And funnily enough, that's also what you want from a ensemble zombie or slasher film, because of course you want to set up the stakes for those characters to get picked off one by one. There's Van, who's this jacked dude who carries a buzzsaw to cut zombies in half, and there's Guzman, who is like a celebrity zombie killer, big on Reddit, as they say in the film. But for my money, the best two characters are Dieter, who is this German whiz kid who's going to crack the casino safe, and Peters, who is this ace helicopter pilot who's going to fly them out of Las Vegas. Now, Peters is an interesting case because actually she was originally played by another actor who was removed from the film because of sexual misconduct allegations. That means that every scene you see Peters in is either a reshoot or has a digitally inserted Tig Notaro in it. I've seen a few critics online saying that they've really noticed that and it's very jarring. I had the opposite experience where I was incredibly surprised that that was an addition to the film after its principal photography had wrapped. And it's not just because the effects are good, although I think they are. I think the reason why it really worked for me is that Tig Notaro is great in the film and really brings a strong flavour to the character that I've really enjoyed. She's basically taking all of the kind of deadpan humour that she's known for as a stand-up and turning it into this extremely laconic take on a pretty standard heist movie type, you know, the driver or the pilot. And I think it's just wonderful. Every scene she's in is so much fun. And the same is true of Dieter, who's played by a German actor called Matthias Schweighofer, and apparently Netflix like him enough that they've actually greenlit a prequel which may not even contain zombies in it. And that is a very low budget kind of rom-com heist comedy that apparently cost like a tiny amount in comparison to this movie. But after seeing it and seeing Dieter, I can't wait to see that film. It looks like a lot of fun. Now there are a few more characters like Scott, Dave Bautista's estranged daughter Kate, who works in a kind of refugee / quarantine camp outside the walls. And there's also a coyote, someone who takes them in and out of Las Vegas, called Lily. But they're all pretty forgettable, and luckily they just mostly serve as fodder for the film, which is kind of exactly what you want a forgettable character to do. So the team assemble and they wait in this refugee camp outside the walls. And when I say refugee camp, I mean it's like a quarantine area for people who used to live in Las Vegas. Although exactly why some of the main cast who were definitely in Las Vegas when it fell are able to not live there is not exactly clear. I'm not really sure how that works, and the film never really explains it, except that it maybe has something to do with money, which is kind of the main motivator for almost everyone in the film. Anyway, this refugee camp is part of, thankfully, a very limited and I think quite misguided attempt to tell a political story with the film as well. You hear a lot about this kind of idiotic president who wants to nuke Las Vegas as part of the 4th of July celebrations. And let's just say, you know, they're not subtle about implying who that is. They never confirm it exactly on screen, but the main candidate's former press secretary Sean Spicer appears very briefly in a cameo in the movie, so, you know, make your own minds up. Like I said, thankfully it's a brief part of the film because I don't actually think Zack Snyder has much to say about it. But it is funny to think that back when he wrote this film in the early noughties, he might have been talking about George Bush as his dumb president character. So that tells you, no matter what changes, some things always stay the same. And then, with the team assembled, they head inside the walls. And this is where I'll stop and say I'm gonna go into spoiler territory. So if you don't want to know anything about the movie, then stop and go and take 2.5 hours to watch this 2-hour, 27-minute film, which gives you 3 minutes to make a coffee and then come back and watch this review. Okay? Cool. When they come through the walls, which are these kind of shipping containers that have been set up to surround Las Vegas, they find thousands of kind of desiccated bodies and skeletons. And Lily tells them that this is the remains of the Shamblers. The Shamblers are kind of classic George Romero type slow-ish zombies, not intelligent, you have to destroy the brain, that kind of stuff. These are the zombies that the survivors would have been familiar with. But now it turns out that Las Vegas is actually pretty much run by the Alphas, who are these intelligent zombies who were directly bitten by the original Patient Zero zombie. He's gone and holed himself up in the Olympus casino, which turns out to be his kind of kingdom, and so the film and the characters call him Zeus. This to me is one of the most interesting ideas in the film, the idea of an actual zombie army, like complete with a leader zombie and everything. I think that's actually something that hasn't been seen that much. There is a series of sci-fi books that I read that has a kind of similar thing, but sort of more based off vampires, but this has a different mechanic to it, and I think it's a fun addition to this kind of zombie world-building lore. Now, they don't do much with it. I mean, they do enough to, justify the concept and make the movie make sense, but I would like to see more exploration of that. So I am interested and kind of excited to see the purported anime sequel series that Netflix is making right now. Yeah, so this film has only just come out and already has a prequel and a sequel series. What are you going to do? This moment where they come into Las Vegas for the first time also really showcases the setting as a part of the film. And I think that's a really important thing that people sometimes forget about. Why is an outbreak in Las Vegas different from an outbreak in New York, an outbreak in LA, an outbreak in London, and so on and so forth? There's a kind of surreal dreamscape vibe to the city that mixes really well with the dreamy cinematography that we've talked about, because you have all of these miniature buildings dotted around the landscape, but they're all quite dilapidated and kind of shoved together. So it makes it a really odd setting and a very distinctive one, which really helps make the movie feel a bit more separate to the rest of the kind of zombie movies. The characters make it to the casino where they're going to go and raid the vault, and along the way have to kind of walk through this very crowded area of Shamblers who are hibernating. So these are zombies who you can avoid as long as you don't shine a light in their eyes or make any loud noises. And of course, you see all your characters going into a tight corridor like that and you immediately know where it's going to go, but it's a really fun set piece that I think is handled really well by Snyder and co. And then the movie just stops for about 40 minutes, which I think is probably the worst thing about the film. Kind of by design, because of the way the heist is laid out before you even start going into Las Vegas in the movie. They're going to have to stop and fix a helicopter that's on the roof and also crack the safe. Unfortunately, that does mean that there's about 40 minutes in the middle where people just stand around slowly fixing things and doing character development moments that don't really work terribly well. And that makes it all the more jarring when the very exciting final third starts up, with a quite literally head-turning moment. Now, I liked the final third of this film almost as much as I didn't like the middle third of the film, and that's because they do a number of really fun things to kind of rise up the tension and deliver this big finale. The first and most important thing is that they move up the nuke deadline, so instead of having a day to do the rest of the heist, they have about 90 minutes, which really ratchets up the tension. And the other thing is that Zeus, this alpha zombie, finally gets sick of them and sends his army towards them. It's here too that not only the action but the gore of the film really ramps up. And I was pretty pleased to see that this movie is very happy to do full gore. I feel like I've been burned too many times by these kind of neat PG to 15 zombie movies where you have a scary looking zombie, but it's just a clean headshot to the head, a little black dot in the middle of the head, and they're down, and that's that. This movie definitely isn't doing that. It's not only happy to use blood, but in fact to do the whole giblets thrown against a wall with a paint bucket at a distance kind of blood. And it's not a realistic take on gore either. It's this kind of comic booky violence that's having fun with the idea of gore. It's not enough for someone's head to get twisted off. You have to see their spine pop out of their shoulder, which I'm pretty sure can't happen, but is cool. So, valuable. And when the ending finally did roll around, I found it a little bit short. which is ironic for a film that's 2.5 hours long, which is, I think, slightly too long for a movie of this type, really. I could have done with maybe 5 more minutes at the end just to wrap up plot threads a bit more. And I suspect that the reason why that doesn't happen is because they wanted to leave open hooks for sequels. Not just prequels and a kind of sequel or sideways anime series, but probably other films as well. I don't know if I'm just old-fashioned about this, because I know that cinematic universes are the norm, not the exception now, but I like a movie to feel finished at the end, and that's something that I really didn't get from this, which is a shame. Still, it was a really enjoyable zombie movie that I think, despite its derivative kind of plot and character archetypes, brought some interesting ideas to zombie world building and lore, and also uses a distinctive visual and stylistic approach to tell a pretty fundamentally enjoyable zombie movie. And for me, that hit the spot. That was just about right. Most of all, I think my favourite things about the film is, firstly, that it has a much more light tone overall, or at least a more sort of irreverent tone than the occasionally very dour superhero stuff that Zack Snyder has done for the last decade. And secondly, I think the film really shows Snyder as someone who is by no means out of ideas. If anything, he's brimming with new approaches and concepts for stuff, even if it is fundamentally derivative plots that he's working on. So having watched this, I am interested to see what he does next. Which I always am, actually. I think he's a fundamentally interesting filmmaker, even though I also personally think that most of his movies are kind of bad. That's it from me, but as ever, I would love to hear what you thought about Army of the Dead. So let's have a chat in the comments below. How do you feel about the movie's visual style and plotting? What do you think about the potential to roll out into a bigger cinematic universe? Or would you rather see Snyder make more original content next? Really interested to hear your thoughts on this probably quite divisive movie. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Artemis, Milla Jovovich, leads her soldiers into the desert to find a missing unit. Suddenly they're enveloped by a mysterious storm which transports them to another world, where giant monsters roam free and wreak havoc. Out of her depth, Artemis meets a lone hunter, Tony Jaa, and together they work to fight the monsters and rejoin Jaa's group of hunters, led by Ron Perlman, to discover the secret behind the storms. Now, Monster Hunter is a bad movie. I mean, I knew that going in. Director Paul W.S. Anderson has a pretty rich filmography of bad movies, of course, because he directed 4 of the Resident Evil films. Now, if you haven't seen those, lucky you. Just know that it's a franchise that's so divorced from continuity that it's actually possible to watch some of the films out of order without even realising it. Now, Anderson has a particular visual style that's dominated by music video 90s stuff like speed ramping, constantly swinging the camera around the characters, unmotivated zooms and shaky cams, and so on and so forth. But he's also made something of a career out of adapting video games into movies, which is probably why he got tapped to make Monster Hunter, which ostensibly draws on a popular Japanese video game franchise. Now, I say ostensibly because the final product bears very little resemblance to the games that it's based on. Yes, there are giant monsters, and the player character, or Milla Jovovich in this version, fights them, hunts them down, but that's about it. The games tend to take place in these kind of grassy savannas, or leafy forests, or even like Arctic tundras, more diverse landscapes than the film's blasted and bland deserts. And the beloved series mascots palicos, which are like these anthropomorphized cat, cook, servants, squires, you name it, that's what they do. They basically support staff for you as a monster hunter. Well, they barely feature in the film, which is a shame because they're one of the most distinctive things about both the video game and the movie, if the movie had, actually made use of them. But like I said, I knew going in that this movie would be a bad movie. But usually Anderson's films are the good kind of bad. They're the kind that kind of make you gape in amazement at the weird visual storytelling, laugh at the rough dialogue, and generally they involve a good time. They're good like beers with mates movies. Monster Hunter unfortunately falls pretty far short of that very low watermark, and most of its problems can be traced to the screenplay. So to give you a sense of what exactly is wrong with the film, let's go back to the story. And by the way, here's some proper spoilers, so if you're planning to watch this terrible film and you want to go in unfettered without any kind of prior knowledge of it, then you should stop watching this video now. Ready? Artemis and co enter the Monster Hunter world. They're attacked, her team is decimated, and as the sole survivor, she teams up with the hunter, Tony Jaa. Together they defeat the monster trapping them in the desert, and they're able to regroup with Jaa's comrades. They gear up and they head out to this mysterious tower to try and stop the magic storm, close the bridge between the worlds, and send Artemis home. It's no great shakes, it's not the most original idea in the world, but it makes sense as a story. You can see it in your head, I'm thinking. You know, Act 1, Artemis arrives and loses her unit and meets Tony. Act 2, they defeat the monster and meet up with Ron. Act 3, they fight their way past a bigger monster towards the tower and send Artemis home, and then maybe there's like a call to adventure afterwards. Classic 3-act stuff. But I think you'll be surprised to find out that actually the first third of that story takes up nearly half of the runtime of the film. Ron Perlman and co don't actually show up until the last 30 minutes, and that cozy resolution that I mentioned, where they kind of go and stop the tower but maybe have a sense of the adventure continuing, that literally doesn't happen in the film, which for some reason cuts in and out of its final battle and then ends on a cliffhanger with no reason given for like the storm, no greater villain established, nothing like that. It's a truly mind-boggling structural choice, and it weighs down the rest of the film in an unbearable way. With no through line and no villain, the characters basically amble from one bad situation to another. There's no setup or payoff because the setting suddenly shifts 2/3 of the way through the movie, and the ostensible core of the emotional story, which is that friendship that blooms between Artemis and Tony, this kind of brother-in-arms type thing, is completely scuppered. Because for some incredible and bizarre reason, they decided to make Tony's character speak a completely different language to Artemis. He literally does not speak English in the film. Okay, like I guess that technically makes sense, right? I mean, they're from different universes, so it's not exactly like he would speak perfect English. But 80% of the movie is just conversations between these two characters. It would be great if the normally kind of stupid convention of everyone speaks English somehow could just happen this one time. It adds insult to injury too that when Ron Perlman finally shows up, he actually does speak excellent English, because apparently this isn't the first time someone crossed over from our world to theirs. And that's a cool plot idea, right? Maybe we're the ones who caused all these problems in the first place? Sounds like rich material to explore, but don't worry, it's never mentioned again. So like I keep saying, Anderson is known for making bad movies. And actually, weirdly, he made one of my favourite movies, Event Horizon. But I think he hasn't made a straightforward good movie since then, and that was in the 90s, so that tells you how long his career's been going on for. But the Resident Evil movies, as dumb as they are at least entertaining. They're interesting. They overflow with big, stupid ideas, they reboot their continuity between each installment, apparently, they're chock full of twists and turns, you know, there's plenty going on. But in Monster Hunter, all I could do was count the bad decisions. From the soldier who serves in the desert, who for some reason wears these big fake eyelashes throughout the movie, to Ron Perlman with his anime haircut, to the film opening with a quote on screen that's never attributed. And there's no good to balance it out with, you know? There's no interesting character backgrounds, there's no cool set pieces, there's not even a good old-fashioned bit of schlock like zombies, you know, something that you know and understand. In short, Monster Hunter sucks. It's bad. Don't go see it. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this very bad movie. Are you a understandably hacked off fan of Monster Hunter, the wider gaming franchise? Or are you one of those weirdos like me who does kind of enjoy a W.S. Anderson movie? Let me know in the comments below, and let's have a chat about it. Have a good one, and bye for now.
I don't know what the hell happened. Power's out everywhere. Cars too.
Jill, Gina Rodriguez, is an ex-con who works night security shifts at a university and has a side hustle in trafficking expired drugs out of the building for resale. While driving her kids to school, a strange flash sparks in the sky, breaking all electronics apparently everywhere on Earth. But the challenges are just beginning, as it transpires that people can no longer fall asleep. Back at the start of the year, Netflix made a big song and dance about how they'd be releasing a new movie every week. Well, they've stuck to that promise, albeit at a cost. What they didn't make clear in the marketing, understandably, is that plenty of the movies would be duds. I think you can see where this review is going. Awake's high-concept setting makes it ideal fodder for Netflix's one-movie-a-week shtick, and it's reminiscent of a number of low-budget sci-fi movies that they've pumped out of the originals department over the years. The common threads are low production values, underbaked stories, at least one actor you recognise, probably more from TV than from films, and a hooky concept that ends up being underexplored and disappointing. We had Extinction, where Michael Pena faced off against alien soldiers, How It Ends, where Forrest Whitaker was a bad father-in-law during the apocalypse, and so on. Now, to its credit, Awake has a far better central idea than those movies, but to its detriment, it has no idea what to do with it. As it becomes apparent that nobody can sleep, society starts to fall apart pretty quickly, suspiciously quickly really. Several characters appear to spout exposition on how bad it is not to sleep. I would have thought society falling into anarchy was more to do with the total crashing of all electronic devices, but apparently not. Anyway. Jill goes back to the university, where it turns out her employer, Murphy, who is a very low-energy Jennifer Jason Leigh, is actually a psychiatrist who specialises in sleep, which seems like a pretty convenient thing for the setting of the movie if you think about it. She reiterates again that not sleeping is very bad. Apparently it'll make your organs fall out and blood gush out of your eyes. I don't think that's actually true, but why not? I've seen weirder shit in movies. Murphy heads off to a military research base nearby, and Jill is encouraged to come along. Unfortunately, by this point, her kid has gotten taken to a culty church, led by Pastor Barry Pepper, who you may recognise as the guy from Battlefield Earth. Excellent credit. And to prepare you for the worst, this is as exciting as the film gets, as the rest of the runtime is filled with Jill slowly road tripping towards the research hub. Yawn indeed. From the off, I think it's clear that director Mark Rasso is more interested in focusing on the dramatic stakes of the concept, the kind of small-scale intimate stuff, rather than the gosh wow big-scale aspects of it. Unfortunately, that means you get very little sense of just how big the problem is, and that's an issue compounded by the obviously stretched and very small budget for the movie. I think I can kind of see what he was going for, which is this sort of boiled frog feeling, like everything is getting slowly worse and worse, and before you realise it, society as you know it is over. Some kind of John Wyndham stuff. But that's not really how it comes across. What it comes across as is boring, with long stretches of inaction, punctuated by implausible set pieces and expository dialogue where characters just recite the screenwriter's research about how bad it is for you not to sleep. I get it. Your eyes are gonna bleed. Okay. Instead of a high-stakes drama with sci-fi trappings, you end up with a glacially paced, underexplored apocalyptic road trip. Oh, and one more thing. As the story wears on, the characters become more and more irrational because they haven't been able to sleep. And as you might know by now, not sleeping is bad for you. I think this is a pretty good idea on the surface of it, because it allows Rasso to really ratchet up the tension, with everyone becoming paranoid and more unreliable. But the direction that takes is literally that everyone just acts more sleepy. So instead of adding tension, with all these unstable people running around, everyone just speaks slower and has a face like when you pour orange juice on your cornflakes by accident. It's not exactly thrilling stuff, and it's really not helped by Rasso's contemporary drama approach to pacing, which slows down these scenes even further, occasionally pushing them into pretty much comedic territory. So that's Awake, which I can confidently recommend you give a miss. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on this movie in the comments down below, if you have anything to say about it. Because now, actually sat here at the end of the review, I feel like I've said my piece. Maybe you really liked the movie. Maybe you thought it was more successfully John Wyndham-y than I did. Love to hear your thoughts on it. Have a good one, and bye for now.
Ho deciso che voglio essere come voi, parlare come voi, pensare come voi.
Oh sì, ma come va facendo? Lascia stare.
Ho riflettuto molto su me stesso e ho sentito come uno spirito creatore che mi divampava dentro, che mi incitava a fare di me uno degli orecchi attraverso cui il mondo sente, uno degli occhi attraverso cui il mondo vede. Insomma, voglio fare lo scrittore.
Martin is a young sailor who saves a rich kid from a beating on the docks. As a thank you, the kid takes him home and introduces him to his sister, Elena, with whom Martin falls in love. Alas, it's not meant to be. Martin's too rough around the edges, too uneducated, and the gap between them is too great to overcome. Maybe. This Italian movie is a very loose adaptation of the Jack London novel of the same name, although it transposes the action to Italy in an ill-defined time period later in the 20th century than the original's 19th century American setting. Now, I knew Jack London mostly for his stories of rugged survival against the odds in the American wilderness. In this somewhat autobiographical story, that's in fact a story of rugged survival in the unforgiving climate of bourgeois politics. The lead is Luca Marinelli, a rising star of European cinema who you might more readily recognise from 2020's The Old Guard. Marinelli is a fantastic find, and his charisma really carries this character through some dark patches that I think other actors might make unsympathetic. Martin's not that easy to like sometimes. He's definitely rough around the edges, and if not exactly involved in criminal undertakings, then at least somewhat adjacent to them. But he's also possessed of this fiery, firm conviction. He's full of big ideas and motivated to do something about them. He has a sort of raw intelligence as well that develops over the course of the film, and I think Marinelli brings that inner story to the surface in surprising ways. He's downtrodden, sometimes violent and often forceful, but also soft and funny. I guess I'd say that he's self-possessed, which in Marinelli's hands is a very attractive attribute. Martin's development from dock worker or dock lurker to intellectual is told through a series of time jumps that really put you on the back foot. The time period the film actually takes place in is pretty unclear. There's lots of signifiers pointing in all different directions, from the fashion to the set design, and there's also archive and found footage that's used for exterior shots that makes it very hard to place. And some of that archive material on top of all of this seems to be figurative. There's a recurring blue-tinted sequence of ships at sea, if I remember correctly, so not all of it is even really supposed to give you a sense of place in the first place. All of that means that when the plot jumps forward by 5 or 10 years, your main clues for that come from Martin himself, suddenly greying, leaning on a cane for support, but also much more self-assured. After the first time jump, Martin suddenly got the ear of the middle classes that he was trying to please, but he obviously finds it pretty hollow. And that's the recurring theme of the movie that really interested me. Martin tries out a whole host of social and political movements in moments that almost feel picaresque. He's attracted to communism, but annoyed by the bickering. The transgression of criminals seems interesting, but also intellectually limited. And of course, Martin himself is a pretty unreliable judge of all these things. For all of his purported rugged individualism and kind of shouting from the parapets about the failures of socialism and the virtues of libertarianism, he's unsatisfied. His motivations are all about pleasing others, finding a place to belong in society. And yet by the time that he's there, it's no longer something that interests or even satisfies him. It's a pretty difficult theme to draw out, but you're encouraged to reflect on it throughout the movie by the structure, where particularly towards the end of the film, the montaging of archive and found footage takes on a very figurative feel, and you're left to kind of interpret what's happening for Martin mentally and to some extent within the story. With all of those heady politics on board, the film is a bit weighed down, and by the end of the movie, pretty low in the water. It fades out rather than ending on a sharp point. Still, a magnetic lead performance by Marinelli, some gorgeous cinematography, and a weighty script that does its best to translate a 19th century autobiographical novel about socialism into something that, you can actually sit down and watch in a cinema, makes this a pretty worthy endeavour, if you ask me. That's it from me, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on this movie in the comments down below. It's actually taken a long time to arrive on screens in the UK. I saw this back at the London Film Festival in 2019, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if you've seen it already, and I'd love to have a chat with you about it. What did you think about the film's political themes? Did you think it was successful in interpreting and kind of communicating that complicated journey, or do you think it fell just short of the mark? And what about that Luca Marinelli, huh? What a talent. Looking forward to having a chat with you in the comments below. Have a good one, and bye for now.
Je vous ai appelé hier pour la petite annonce.
Voilà la bête. 100% d'un.
Tuerie.
Georges is a man seduced by an object of immense power, a deerskin jacket with fringed trim. At least in Georges' eyes. To us, it's a relatively forgettable bit of kitsch. You see, putting the jacket on transforms him into a more confident, decisive individual, but at great financial and personal cost. Cut off from his previous life, he holes up in a remote hotel and begins to engage in a series of duologues with the jacket that inspire him to more and more desperate feats. Deerskin is the latest in a series of seriously offbeat, off-kilter comedies by director Quentin Dupieux, also known as Mr. Oiseau in his previous life as an influential maker of electronic music. You might remember Rubber, the story of a murderous telekinetic tire that devastates a small American town. That's this guy. Deerskin is an altogether more grounded film, which only serves to make the story it tells even more surprising. Playing on this weird interpretation of a midlife crisis just to start with, it quickly develops into something with much higher stakes and serves that up alongside a light bit of meta-commentary about films and filmmaking, just as Rubber did. Georges is Jean Dujardin, best known to Anglophone audiences as the titular lead of The Artist. But Dujardin is arguably more well known in France as a comedic talent, a straightforward kind of comedy actor, particularly for his excellent series of Eurospy spoofs OSS 117, also directed by the guy who did The Artist. Here he plays Georges with a tremendously funny understatement. The reveal of this jacket, the beast as he calls it, is a good example. For all that Dupieux plays up the power of the jacket, it's Georges softly muttering "fuck" under his breath that really sells it. Georges' situation becomes desperate pretty quickly. He's out of money and away from any personal connections, and Dujardin really sells that in a kind of emotional way. It makes him quite vulnerable, and that's before the transformative power of the jacket starts to turn him into someone altogether more dangerous and erratic. And then on the flip side to that kind of mercurial energy, his performance as the jacket, as the voice that he's talking to, and I know that's a weird sentence, but these are the sort of movies that Dupieux makes. That performance is almost infinitely calm and kind of self-assured. And the contrast between the two performances, often within the same scene, gives those moments excellent comedic tension. You never really know what the movie's going to do next, and I think his performance is a big part of that. Georges is stuck in a timeless, or maybe more accurately a static in time, alpine area of rural France, which is rendered here as this sort of small town, grotty, wood-panelled hell. There he finds a kindred spirit in Denise, who's played by this very game Adèle Haenel. She's a local who studied film and who is working in a bar, and he commissions her to edit together these shoddy mini DV tapes of him parading around in his jacket. And without wanting to get into spoilers, because I think the film is tremendous fun and very surprising, so you should go into it relatively blank, she's also a reluctant part of his ultimate holy mission, which is this crusade against other jackets, motivated by his own, which can't stand the existence of inferior garments. And that's where the big stakes of the movie tie back into that initial premise of this kind of kooky interpretation of a midlife crisis. It's that plot, the construction of a film about the jacket and the wearing of the jacket, that gives what little structure the film actually has, as well as offering a bit of discourse about making films and what value might be inferred from that, working practices and so on and so forth. And I say offers that discourse because I don't think Dupieux is actually massively interested in it. Deerskin is quite happy just being interesting and weird and frequently funny, and it really isn't trying to make any big or serious points, I think, which is fine. Again, that's sort of like Rubber, which was marketed as a weird horror movie on the kind of grindhouse circuit, but actually spends much more time on this kind of Greek chorus of voyeurs gathered outside the town who watch the damage and the carnage going on inside. It's much more interested in that than it is of the plot of the film itself. Besides, Deerskin is basically over before it really has time to develop any of these ideas anyway. It runs at a very brisk 77 minutes, but I think that's more of a blessing than a curse. As interesting as the jacket is, and as interesting as Georges' kind of journey into hell is, it's hard to see how the plot would hold together any longer than that. So, better to burn bright, I say. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this very weird, kooky art house comedy. Were you a fan of Rubber when it came out, even if you were wrong-footed by the marketing? Or have you seen the rest of Dupieux's movies and now interested in him as a kind of auteur working in the comedy scene? Would love to hear your thoughts on this. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Earlier this month, Netflix released the first movie in a trilogy of horrors focusing on teens living in the spooky, scary town of Shadyside. And then a week later they released the second movie, and then a week later the third movie, which is this bizarre and innovative and really quite interesting releasing strategy, but still not the most interesting thing about the film, because as it turns out, the Fear Street trilogy is really, really good. I know, shocking, right? That an R.L. Stine adaptation, and not even his most famous book series at that, has actually ended up being a proper series of horrors. It's gory, it's spooky, it also has some really interesting ideas at its core. And I thought that because there were free movies, it was worth doing free reviews. So I'm going to walk you through Fear Street 1994, 1978, and 1666, and there will be some spoilers. So if you haven't seen these films, just take it as a token of my appreciation for how good they are, that I'm doing like a half-hour long video review about them. It should show you that I'm serious about these movies being good and they are well worth your time. So check them out and then check back in here.
Dude, what the hell?
This is exactly why you have no friends.
Look, some gal killed a bunch of people at the mall last night.
Holy shit.
In 1994, teen Dina is depressed after the breakup of her relationship with girlfriend Sam, who not only broke up with her, but moved to another town. Dina lives in Shadyside, a low-rent part of town that seems to be cursed with mass killings that occur every few years. Sam has moved to Sunnyvale, a much richer, nicer town that doesn't seem to have any social problems at all. Tensions between these two rival towns are always high, but they're coming to a boil because yet another massacre took place in Shadyside, where a teen in a skullface mask stabbed a load of his colleagues in a murder spree. Dina and Sam almost come to blows, but are stopped when something strange happens. And it's something that's otherworldly, supernatural. This is the so-called Curse of Sarah Fear, who is a famous witch who died in Shadyside centuries before. The opening moments of the film make it clear that director Lee Janiak, who made all three of the films, is really focused on using tropes from horror that's contemporary to the period that the film is set in, to kind of ground it in a kind of period feel, I suppose. So in this case, she's talking about the 90s slashers, you know, Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and stuff like that. And I say it's obvious from the beginning because it actually begins with a pretty well-observed pastiche of Scream. We have Maya Hawke, who is probably the most well-known person in this cast, and she's working late at this mall. She gets a phone call that sounds like it might be coming from inside the building type thing, and then she gets murdered. And that's it for her in the movie. And so much like when Drew Barrymore appears in the first 10 minutes of Scream and then gets murdered on screen in this kind of really subversive way, I guess. It's kind of Wes Craven doing a bit of a meta thing in the way that he does with the rest of the Scream films as well. They do the same thing here, and of course it's like almost a double meta because they're calling back to Scream in the way that Scream then played with people's expectations. But I think that's the right side of parody or pastiche, you know. I'm a little bit anti those things because I think they often require more knowledge from the film watcher than they ought to. And then they end up in a sticky spot where it's like, well, if I know enough about this to get this reference, then I'm bored because I know this topic too well, or I think you've done it badly, or I'm sitting there like, what are you referencing? What are you making fun of here? In this case, I think it actually works really well on its own because that's still a good twist. You know, if you're a teenager who's watching this who's never seen Scream, then you don't know that that's a reference to Scream, but the twist just works fine for you. And the less kind of pastiche, tropey period touches are also really good. The art direction of the film does a great job of grounding it in that early 90s moment. Dina's little brother, who's played by Benjamin Flores, who was in another Netflix original called Rim of the World. Quite an interesting talent, I think a good guy, a good actor. When he's introduced, he's sat on those like boxy cream beige computers on an AOL chat room, and that felt to me like a really specifically 90s moment that was really lovely and well observed. Not everything's like that, you know, it's still a contemporary film, and there's a lot of neon cross lighting that doesn't really feel very 90s, it feels very modern, but it's for a modern audience. I think those kind of things are acceptable. Another way that they set up the time period is a little more annoying, and I think it's the most consistently annoying thing across all three films, and that's this kind of jukebox musical aspect to the movie. Janiak uses a lot of like contemporary music from the 90s to set up what's going on and then the time and place that they're in. But they are constantly cutting from song to song. And a lot of them are obvious choices too. When it comes to 1978, I know someone who was like, I bet they're gonna use Don't Fear the Reaper in this. And then they did. And then it's like, well, when are they gonna use Psycho Killer? You know? Oh, here, okay, great. And that's something that's, like I said, is consistent across all the films. In this one, I found it the most jarring. I think the edits are very, very quick. It reminded me in a negative way of watching like a Cameron Crowe movie. I don't know if you've seen Elizabethtown, but that film literally cuts from like the middle of a song to the start of another song, and it's just a lot. So that's all the kind of cutesy elements of the movie. It's pastiches, all the kind of poppy stuff that makes up that part of the film. But what about this movie as a horror film? I was going into this expecting basically like a YA-focused horror, where it was a little scary, it had scares around the edges, but mostly it was pretty soft. And I was very pleasantly surprised to find that the film is a fair bit more daring than it might originally appear, but also a lot more gory. And there is one particular death that occurs near the end of this film that is truly gross, like a really nasty effect, and I did not see it coming, that level of violence. But perhaps more importantly than the gore, the film is actually a proper horror in the way that it's constructed. And that opening sequence of Maya Hawke is a really good example. You know, Janiak, and God, I hope that I'm pronouncing that right, because that's how I'm going to do it for the rest of the video. She's playing with these very familiar tropes, but she's kind of constructing them in a way that they could be read fresh. And I think that's a thing that runs across all three films. We have Maya Hawke alone as a young woman at night, closing up her shop, and there's this moment where she thinks she's being attacked, and it turns out it's just her mate, who actually does end up being the guy who attacks her later on. And I think that plays off a tension that's like, very familiar, I'm sure, to lots of women, where it's about like, is this guy my friend, or is he actually going to hurt me in this instance? And that lends a real tension to those scenes because they're very dramatic as a result. You know, she's being stabbed by this guy and saying like, why? Like, I don't understand what's happening. So she's running away from this killer, she gets caught by him, she gets killed by him, and then she's pleading for her life with a guy that she knew or knows. And that whole sequence is a really clever bit of filmmaking because it sets up the tone. You know, you have this kind of parodic element that then turns serious. You get a sense of where the horror is being pitched. You have a couple of spooky jump scares and then some gore, so it's quite a poppy horror, it's not too cerebral. And you also get the beginnings of the plot because we start to see that maybe these people aren't really spree killers, there's some kind of possession thing going on. And then to kind of cap it and put a cherry on top, it all happens in the shadow of the tree where Sarah Fear died. All those years ago in 1666, as we eventually find out. And you get to see this tree kind of looming over events, kind of stuck up in the middle of this mole. Somehow it survived, or the mole's been built around it. And Janiak has a clever screenplay that takes full advantage of that. You know, it starts off with that big attention-grabbing sequence, but uses it to quietly set up the plot. And then we've got Dina and her younger brother, who is kind of obsessed with the Shady Side murderers. So he's the kind of exposition guy, the info dumper. And then her and her kind of group of mates, plus Sam, end up embroiled in this new possession. See, I'm a bit of a sucker for the idea of like an original sin in a horror movie. And I think it's something that I see in all my favorite horrors. Like every X-Files episode basically has an original sin. And by that, I don't mean the biblical sense of it. What I mean is that like, I think a good horror movie is about something evil that's happening to people in the present day. And then there is some sort of prior act of violence that sits underneath the events, motivates them, explains them, and that gives it a weight. And that means you can be bittersweet because that thing cannot be resolved. You can make claims about like society and ethics within that context as well. And also it can lead to a happy ending, you know, because that means that there is a way out of the horror, which is something that I struggle with in movies like, say, the more anarchic slashers, films like The Strangers, where I'm struggling to understand what the point is. You know, I don't know the motivations of the people or what happens to them afterwards, and they just kill everyone and that's the end of the movie. So this isn't that, and I enjoyed that a lot. But I like that it was almost a self-aware kind of tropey take on that original sin thing. You know, it's not just enough for there to have been this violent act that took place in the 1600s, but that there are actually bones like hanging out, apparently just loose, like available to touch in the forest, and somehow have turned to ash, like, you know, in that intervening 500 years or whatever, but there you go. One of the things that took me by surprise in the film was the central lesbian romance between Dina and ex-girlfriend Sam. I knew that Dina was a lesbian character, but I was expecting something like that kind of tokenistic stuff that you see, for instance, in like a Disney movie, where they're like, yeah, this character's gay, and they'll say that they're gay maybe even, but they won't do anything gay on screen, and they won't be gay. I was expecting like, oh yeah, I really like girls, but I'm not currently in a relationship with one, it's just stopped, and I'm pining after them, and I might look at women sometimes, but we won't ever like touch or anything on screen. So you can imagine my surprise when the film actually treats that lesbian relationship as a central motivation for almost the entire trilogy. It's not just like a tokenistic thing, it's one of the most weighty things in the movie, and it's incredibly important to understanding the subtext of the other two kind of plot lines as well. And not only that, but there is like a sex scene between these characters. It's pretty tame, don't get me wrong, but that's fine. It shows that they're acknowledging an actual lesbian identity on screen, as opposed to using it as like wallpaper to make themselves seem more progressive than they actually are. It's not a perfect script. I think some of the lines are a little on the nose, and I think that the last act of the movie kind of just wraps up a little too quickly. I don't mean the sequel hook for the next section, I mean the section in the supermarket where two characters who are very important get killed very quickly in quick succession, and that to me felt a little unearned and kind of destroyed some of the character development that had happened, for instance for Benjamin Flores' character, Dina's brother. But still, I was kind of blown away by the film because I think I went in with low expectations and I discovered that it's an effective chiller with these clever, scary, gory ideas. I like that it's accessible for a teenage audience, but it's also pleasingly kind of scary and poppy in equal measure. I think in terms of balancing those two tones, it's probably a little too poppy to be fully frightening, but I think that makes it like a great sleepover movie, for instance. I like that it's, you know, made for an audience that absolutely shouldn't be watching it, but absolutely will. That's the way that I kind of conceived of it as I watched it. Yeah, on that note, I'm just going to read you one line from what I wrote down when I watched the film. It's like if American Horror Story was a consistent, coherent idea. There you go. So at the end of 1994, Sam and Dina have made up. They've kind of lost their friends along the way, but they've got each other at least, and finally the witch's curse is over. Nope, joking, it's not. Sam is definitely possessed. A bit of a wrinkle in the plan. And 78 picks up exactly where that dropped off, with C. Berman, who is played by Gillian Jacobs from Community, alone in her house, drinking heavily and relying on a very large system of alarm clocks to keep track of her life. And this is again like a good opening. It's an effective bit of characterization that kind of portrays her without really saying anything about her. It shows it on screen. It's just basic screenwriting. You love to see it. Please, I'm so bored of watching blockbusters that can't just write basic scenes. Thank you, Lee Janiak. The kids show up to consult her because she is, as far as they know, the only survivor of one of these kind of Shady Cider mass killings. And so she launches into this story, apparently in the third person, so that she doesn't give away her identity until the end, about 1978, the Camp Nightwing massacre.
Who's seen us? Run!
And so after that brief introduction, we have a new cast and a new setting and a new time period. And I'm really jazzed about that part of this trilogy. I really enjoy stuff that looks at the same place through different periods of time. I like time jumps because I think you can do interesting dramatic things with them in terms of tension, you know, how have these people changed, stuff like that. And like I said, I'm a sucker for original sin, you know, in that horror sense, because it gives an extra layer to the story that the horror's telling. It allows you to do kind of more dramatic things with it instead of just, here's a random killer who showed up out of nowhere. It's not that, it's a witch's curse, that kind of thing. And 78 does something really interesting with time, but I'll get there in a sec. Let's talk about the plot of the movie. Ziggy, played by Sadie Sink, is this kind of tearaway, a bit of an outcast at Camp Nightwing. The camp is half and half Shadysiders and Sunnyvalers, so there's a lot of tension, and we keep seeing more of what we saw in 1994 about the rivalry between those towns, and also this kind of socioeconomic message that I think comes out more here than in 1994, which is like, not only has Shadyside got this curse on it that means there's like a mass killing every 30 years, but also it's crushed like economically. There's something wrong with it as a place, which means people can't really leave and nothing good happens there, which almost reminded me of Derry in It, the Stephen King story, where it's this town that's kind of got this deep curse that has this supernatural elements to it, but there's also very grounded things that curse causes problems for people in real ways. So Ziggy and her sister Cindy don't get on because Ziggy feels that Cindy is trying to pretend like she's better than she is. She's trying to dress up nicely, she has this new polo shirt that she's very sensitive about getting damaged, and that happens repeatedly over the course of the film. And she's trying to like save up to get into college, And Ziggy, on the other hand, is very resigned about being stuck in Shadyside forever. I like it when a horror movie does something like that because it adds weight to these sometimes like slightly too fantastical settings that you can get in a horror thing. You know, should I really be afraid of a witch? I don't think witches exist, really, so it's sometimes hard for me to struggle to bother about that. But if I can see something like that, the tensions between town people, these economic disparities between them, these injustices, these historical injustices, then that is a thing I can get behind, and it's like that can motivate and ground those more fantastical elements like the witch's curse and stuff like that. It's rad, it's good filmmaking, Lee. So Ziggy is actually getting pretty severely bullied, and kudos to Sadie Sink, who plays her. You might recognize her from Stranger Things, which coincidentally is made by the Duffer Brothers, and Lee Janiak's husband is one of the Duffer Brothers, I can't remember which, so nice little cast connection there, as is Maya Hawke in 1994. So Ziggy's getting badly bullied enough that she's actually almost hanged by this group of teens, which is kind of wild, and you have to think, ooh, maybe that's the witch's curse too. Maybe kids are just awful. Hard to say. Anyway, Nick Good, who is the sheriff in 1994, comes out of the woods. He's like just about 18, and he's the love interest for Ziggy in the film. He comes and basically makes sure she gets out of there okay. And they kind of have this will they get into a relationship or won't they kind of thing throughout the movie. The only person in camp who's nice to Ziggy is the nurse, Nurse Lane, whose daughter was one of the Shadyside killers, and in fact one of the ones who was summoned in 1994. She's the one with the razor blade who does the cute song and has the nice hair. So this is another reason why I like this structure, because it allows the films to set up stuff that then pays off in different ways that is sometimes subverting expectations in the other movies. So we know that Nick is this sheriff who isn't necessarily that helpful in 1994, and then we see him as like this good guy who's also interested in law and order in 1978, and that's a really interesting character dynamic, one that's only possible because we see two different versions of that character over a broad period of time. And something similar, although a little different, is happening with the nurse as well, because we know what her daughter's like. She's this like psychotic killer who's otherworldly and all that stuff, and then we get to see the human impact of that in 78 when we see how downtrodden this woman is, and obviously she's become obsessed with the witch's curse. So that's a good example of using those kind of supernatural things to motivate these quite grounded and sad themes, and vice versa. I think that's a really interesting one there. Nurse Lane unfortunately has gone a little bit nuts, who could blame her, and tries to stab Tommy, who is the boyfriend of Cindy. She doesn't manage it, which is a shame because he quickly gets possessed and turns into the Nightwing killer, who we also saw in 1994, although he had a bag over his head in that one. And then after that, pretty much all hell breaks loose, and a number of children are murdered, which was a grim thing that I wasn't expecting, although I know that the killings take place at a summer camp, so yeah, I don't know what I was expecting really. And as you might suspect from looking at it, once again Janiak is playing with these genre expectations that come from horror movies of that time period. And this film owes a lot to those kind of summer camp slashers. I'm talking about stuff like, obviously, Friday the 13th. There's also elements of Halloween in there, and slightly later stuff like Sleepaway Camp, things like that. The most direct reference is that Tommy ends up wearing this kind of rough sack over his head, which is the original mask that the killer had in Friday the 13th. And I think the script is quite clever with this because it takes these very familiar horror tropes, which we see quite a lot of. I think there's lots of like 70s adjacent kind of slasher jokes made in other horror movies and things like that. But what she does with it is then use that structure to tell a more supernatural story than you might expect with that idea, because we end up following Cindy and Alice, who's one of her childhood mates, into this series of underground caverns which turn out to be underneath Camp Nightwing. And down there they find a witch's lair, they find this weird moss growing, apparently where Sarah Fear lost her hand, which is part of the big myth around her. And that feels like a more modern set of story beats to me. It doesn't feel like something that would have been done in a movie in the 70s. And the added benefit of layering the action like that is that it means that the film feels a bit more contained than 1994. To me, 1994's biggest issue with its script was this kind of feel of like, go to this location, get a plot token to move on, go to another location. And that can make it feel kind of episodic. It's like hard to understand how the story's really unfolding. It feels almost video gamey, I think, sometimes. And none of that's really on display here because they're just in the camp running around between a few buildings, and there's basically two plot lines that take place above and below each other. easy, simple to keep track of, and allows them to focus on scary stuff, as well as expanding the story. And as this is the middle movie, it's an interesting position to sit in a trilogy, and it's important to think about these films as a trilogy, you know? You've got 1984 is essentially the first act, where you have this self-contained horror movie that tells like a supernatural slasher story. And then we go one layer deeper, both literally in the story and also in terms of telling that story, where we start to see some of the lore be uncovered in the Camp Nightwing massacre. And part of that's because the kids have come to see Berman, who's telling them this story. She's trying to communicate to them what she found out about Sarah Fear, but also it's about the investigation that those two other characters, her sister and her mate, undertook in the caverns. Of course, how does she know that that's what happened? I don't know, because no one else is there who survives, so that seems like a bit of a plot problem. And as I said before, she's telling the story apparently in the third person, because at the end, when it turns out that, shock twist, Ziggy is actually C. Berman, not Cindy, it's kind of a surprise to everyone sat there listening to it. And I don't know how that would work if she was telling the story. Surely she'd say, yeah, that was me. I got hung on the tree by those bullies. Still, that's just fun. It's just fun tropey convention. And I think that kind of stuff is a pretty white lie to tell in a filmmaking context. Oh, and by the way, on that twist, I literally didn't feel that as a twist. I don't know if it's because I watch a lot of movies or because I write some of my own stuff, but when I watched that film, you know, Ziggy showed up and I was immediately like, yeah, that's Gillian Jacobs. Of course it's not Cindy, who is a completely different character, who looks slightly different even. Yeah, it did not shock me at all. However, again, I can't help but think that the main audience for these films is not me. It's probably like 17, 18-year-olds. And that might work for them, you know. I'm not an 18-year-old. I haven't actually been an 18-year-old for quite some time. But I think that might work for that audience. And maybe more importantly, I think it's not like a load-bearing twist, by which I mean one of those M. Night Shyamalan or Saw-style twists that like changes the entirety of what you've already seen. It's just like a little sweetener, a little kick on the end of the movie. I don't think it really makes that much difference because we don't really know C. Berman except for that one scene at the start of this movie. And so to find out that she's not the person that we thought she was is like, fine. Nothing much, really. Nurse Lane has made this kind of hand-drawn map of the camp and overlaid it over the original settlement where all the Puritans lived, where Sarah Fear was tried and hanged. And it's a really potent image that kind of sums up what this story does for history in the context of horror, because it's like she's literally taken a version of the past and overlaid it on the present. And we see that when they go down into these caves, which are kind of a mass sigil on which the town is overlaid. So we have this kind of layering of historical images of different versions of a place. And it's something that this film in particular versus the other two manages to do a lot of, I think because it's in the middle. Another example of what I mean is in the opening where Ziggy is being hung on the tree. We identify that tree immediately as viewers as being the tree that was in Shadyside Mall. And so we're able to say, right, okay, so that's where this is taking place, like physically. It's quite clever filmmaking because it makes it feel like a continuous universe, but it's also part of that rich thematic underpinning for this otherwise quite dumb series of slashers. So yeah, some genuinely scary slasher stuff in this one, lots of kids dying, some interesting lore being introduced, and kind of reflecting the lesbian romances in the first film. I think there is quite a strong queer subtext for Cindy and Alice, who are these childhood best friends who grew apart and then come back together. It's not really my place to kind of do that full read, I don't think, but there's a lot there if you read it with that in mind. And of course, there's the other love story in this one, which is Ziggy and Nick, which takes on a completely different significance once we find out who Nick really is in 1666. But we'll cover that when we get there. And my last thought on 1978 is that it's once again a mostly fresh-faced cast. I'm really struck by these movies having very few big names in them, not very recognizable actors outside of like Gillian Jacobs and Maya Hawke, and to some extent Sadie Sink. They're new, and I think that's really nice. It's nice that Fear Street feels like a fresh IP. I know it's based off a book series, but it's not that much like the books as I understand it. And it's nice that it's a relatively new director as well. And it's additionally nice, so much niceness, that there's mostly new actors in it. People like Emily Rudd, who plays Cindy, or the excellently named McCabe Sly, who plays Tommy Slater, the Nightwing Killer. I think they're both very good, and they get to show off quite a lot of stuff over the course of this movie and then the following one. So fingers crossed this film will launch some new careers. And what a fresh feeling it is. You know, it feels new, this series of films, in some ways, that you might not expect, considering that it's largely structured around parodying existing horror tropes. And so in the end of the 1978 section, Cindy and Ziggy take this severed hand of Sarah Fear and they try to put it to rest with her body, which is underneath the hanging tree. Except it isn't. And again, we already know that because in 1994, we saw where the body really was. It's what kicked off the whole series of events. After the car crash, Sam's blood got on Sarah Fear's bones. And so they're doomed, and Cindy dies, and it feels really, really heart-wrenching because we've followed her and Ziggy throughout the whole movie. And Ziggy somehow survives, and I have some ideas about that once we talk about 1666, but we then cut back to the present day, and the plan is on. They're gonna go and put the hand back with Sarah Fear's body. And that's the end of 1978. Right, time for another water break for me. Stay hydrated, all right?
The devil has come to feast on our misdeeds. And his darkness grows within each of us.
Sarah Fear, you know nothing good comes from those woods after sundown.
Once again, 1666 picks up where the previous film left off, which is back in 1994, Dina touching Sarah Fear's bones and suddenly having a vision of being Sarah Fear. She's like adopting the body of Sarah Fear in a flashback of some kind. And in fact, most of the townsfolk of Union, which is this small Puritan settlement where the majority of the story in 1666 takes place, are drawn from the cast of 1994 and 1978. It's a really fun thing. It's called multi-rolling. It doesn't tend to come up much in film, but you see it a lot in theatre. And done well, multi-rolling can be used to play with audience expectations. Because we see Tommy Slater as this kind of good guy in 1978 before he's unfortunately corrupted by the influence of the evil that's in Shadyside. We then see him as Mad Thomas in this completely horrible role in 1666, and it's really shocking because you're thinking, God, he's nothing like his previous portrayal there. But some characters seem to be slightly the same. So Kate, who is this kind of drug-dealing honor roll student in 1994, is the equivalent of like this Puritan pusher in 1666, where she's like saying, hey, let's go get high off berries that the witch has gathered, stuff like that. So this is what the previous two films have been building up to, alluding to the life of Sarah Fear. And of course, because it's a story, we find out it's nothing like we originally thought it would be. And the first half of this movie, which is set in 1666 before they go back to 1994 Part 2, is entirely about the life story of Sarah Fear and what really happened. Because of course, spoilers, but also you absolutely know this, you shouldn't be this far in this video without having watched these films. Nick Good, the sheriff of the modern day setting, is actually the distant descendant of Solomon Good, who's one of these Puritans, who it turns out was the original guy to make a deal with the devil. And that deal kind of shakes out like this. He gets what he wants, he gets power, he gets influence, and probably some other stuff too if he asks for it nicely enough. And in exchange, he writes down the name of one person who's going to be corrupted by this like evil, bubbling, tar, tumor-like thing that lives in the caves with the witch's lair. And that person is going to go and murder a whole load of other people. So now we know that the goods are the real baddies. The goods are evil, as the film very on the nose announces. We know that they've basically been using human sacrifice to make their town nicer. And that's where the broad theme of the film finally becomes clear, which is a kind of reflection on how people often make it, as it were, get their wealth, find their comfort off the blood, literally in this case, sweat and tears of other people. You know, there's no utopia that isn't built on the back of someone who's been oppressed. And this is a really good example of that, because Nick and his family, by extension, have been using this supernatural tool to make them succeed and kind of pretending like it's their work. You know, Nick is the sheriff, his brother is the mayor, and yet none of them actually put in the labor behind that. It was magic. It was something that they were doing. I guess they were breaking the rules for themselves and not caring about it. And it's interesting too then that the outcome of this is that there has to be a version of their town that's terrible to live in. And so they've constructed a reality that's good for them, but it is at the expense of a large group of other people. And of course there's a generational disparity too, because these gaps between the wealthy and the poor, in this case the goods and Shadyside, is getting more and more entrenched as the years go on, not least because this deal with the devil is hereditary. So it's just like inherited wealth in that sense. And I don't think this film is the serious take on generational wealth injustices, but I do think it's a good theme. Like, it's a good exploration of that in a relatively simplistic horror setting, at least. And it's nice to watch something like this that is so poppy and so construed for fun, but does have an idea at the heart of it and does want to make that quite clear. It's similar to how clear it is about its lesbian romance, where it's saying like, this isn't something just to chuck in for wallpaper, this is an important thing that motivates part of the story and grounds it. And when you do get this final reveal, you can really feel the anger of the characters who find out about it. And I am there with them in that moment. It's a real like grounding moment for this very fantastical and quite silly final section in 1994, where they defeat the baddie. Ultimately, the Shadysiders are the victims of violence that's nothing to do with them, and it's been inflicted on them. And my favourite little detail about this that I think is really well observed is right at the end, after all the other stuff's happened, Dina and Sam exit these underground tunnels through Nick Good's house, and it's full of motivational posters. Like, you know, those ones with the pictures of animals, like an eagle taking off over a lake, and it says like, hope, you can do better, believe in yourself. And it's such an interesting character detail to have this guy who is literally inherited the ability to have whatever he wants at the price of someone else's suffering, and yet he still feels the need to kind of motivate himself, to think about that as like something good that he's doing for himself. It strikes me as like a really incisive bit of satirical look at like the rich, I guess. But for all that it's kind of like fulfilling the destiny of this trilogy to kind of tell you about the original story that's underneath everything, I think it's also the installment that's most at danger of becoming unmoored, becoming adrift. And the reason why I think that's the case is that it's not that clear what this one is structured around. You know, you had these 90s slashers as 1994's reference. We had the 70s camp slashers as these like references for 1978. But in 1666, what is Janiak riffing off? Is it like The Witch, Robert Eggers? Is it folk horror, maybe? You know, stuff like The Wicker Man? I don't think she is doing that. And she also doesn't have the option of leaning back on this jukebox stuff that's been used way too much in 1994 and 1978. She can't like put on popular tracks that the Puritans used to listen to, because you can't exactly get that stuff on Spotify. She should be out of her depth here. And actually, I think it's a real testament to how good Janiak is a director, that without any of that kind of similarity of reference to anything else previous in the trilogy, she's able just to completely do her own flavour for it, and it really works out. With one exception, and it's something that unfortunately almost derailed this film for me, which is the accents. The way I see it, you're doing Puritan stuff with Americans, you've got like a few options. The easiest option is to have them be American and speak in like an oldie worldy way, and that's basically it. You could do The Witch, where you know extensively research how Puritans spoke and then portray it in like a kind of verbatim way, most likely working with English actors when you're doing that. Or you could do what they did here, which is everyone has an Irish accent of varying quality. Some people just drop it entirely as soon as possible. And unfortunately, despite some valiant attempts, I once again think McCabe Sly is very good. Mad Thomas's accent is very accurate. Dina's accent is awful. It's really, really bad. And I think the actress is good, you know, Kiana Madeira, she did well in everything else, but her Irish accent is terrible. And that's a shame, but what are you gonna do? Luckily, it doesn't completely derail the film because you're so familiar with the characters by that point and you know what you want to get out of the story that it's not really a problem. And I think you get used to it after the first 10 minutes or so. But boy, is it rough. When they first start doing it, it's like, ooh, not good. Now, it's interesting that this focuses so closely on Sarah Fear, because putting her at the middle of this witch hunt kind of inverts the structure of the previous films. In 1994, and to some extent in 78, we are with a bunch of characters who are being wronged by someone who they believe is Sarah Fear, and so they're trying to track her down, stop her, like interpret what's going on, and they don't really know what's going on. In the flip side here, Sarah is the main character, we know everything that's going on for her, but she doesn't know the central mystery itself, and she's hunting for someone else. Of course, as it turns out, because Solomon Good is really the baddie behind everything, it is kind of like the structure of the first two films, but it's an interesting contrast that the film sets up early on. So that's good fun. And of course, we also find out that Sarah is a lesbian as well, or at least has desires for another woman, who is, in this case, Hannah Miller, played by the same actress who plays Sam. So it's a Dina, Sam, Hannah, Sarah romance that's going on in this movie as well. And again, it puts a lesbian relationship at the heart of the weighty part of its storytelling. The last moments of Sarah's life are about doing something to protect Hannah. And I think that's really powerful. It helps that the performers are very good and they have good chemistry with each other. But I think the story itself there is really rich, and it's one, again, that isn't using LGBT representation as kind of tokenistic thing. So back to 1994 for the final sequence of 1666. It's slightly confusing when they do this with the titles. It was working well up until now, but now it's a bit confusing. And the characters go to Shadyside Mall, where the story all started, which is a nice kind of loop tying it all back together, because as we know, the Shadyside Mall is the site of where Sarah Fear originally died and is built on top of these underground caverns that contain the witch's lair. And so there we've got this kind of like triple level now of history upon history, like the way in which stories are imprinted on a place, because we find out that the mole has access down into those caverns, as you imagine it would, because we saw that there was some access to the surface in the caverns in 1978. I think the literature term for this is a palimpsest, which is like a piece of parchment that you've written something on, and then you've erased that, and then you write over it again, but you can still read or see markings of the other text underneath it. And so they're texts that are overlapping, they're superimposed over top of each other. Maybe it's a bit of a reach to say that the Fear Street trilogy is a cinematic palimpsest that addresses generational wealth disparity, but someone's got to say it, and I just did. So put that in your pipe and smoke it. And I think that's something that's apparent to the characters as well. There was a lovely moment here that I think is really well judged, and I don't know if it was discovered in the editing room or if it was planned in the script, where Gillian Jacobs, Ziggy, grown up, and Dina both stand and look at the tree that's in the middle of the Shadyside Mall. Ziggy looks at that and sees her sister. You know, she has this flash of her sister. She's thinking about her sister who died in the shadow of that tree. Dina looks at it and sees Sarah Fear hanging there and sees Hannah Miller watching her. And so both of them are looking at this one object, but interpreting different types of trauma and violence that have occurred around it through the lens of this single location. And I think that's very clever, adroit, and dare I say, thematically rich filmmaking. And it is far too clever to have any space in something like this, and yet it does. And I think that's one of the wonderful things about this series of films. I think they are earnest in the story they're trying to tell, while also being silly and broad and poppy and pastiche and all that kind of stuff. And that seems like a good place to stop, because I think there's plenty more to talk about in these films, but I'd love to talk to you about it. I hope that you've seen those Fear Street movies and that they spoke to you in the same way that they did to me, or maybe in your own way. I'd love to hear more about what you thought about them. And if they didn't speak to you, I hope that this video helped illuminate some ways in which they might in future, and maybe you can give them a second go. Have a good one, and bye for now.
Welcome home, honey, where you belong.
Riley Finn returns home to Crockett Island, the isolated fishing community where he grew up, after serving a jail sentence for killing a teen in a drink driving accident. Now sober and rejecting his former Catholic faith, Riley's return shakes up the small community, but not as much as the other new arrival, charismatic priest Father Paul Hill. Amidst all this upheaval, a deadly series of events starts to occur on the island as townsfolk report strange sightings at night. Midnight Mass is very much a passion project for Mike Flanagan. If you're a big fan of his work, you might recognise it as the name of the novel that Kate Siegel is writing in his first feature film, Hush. And it also comes up as a novel again in his adaptation of Gerald's Game, the Stephen King book. And that's a good comparison point, because this also feels very much like Stephen King, to the point where it's almost kind of pastiche at points, I suppose. We can see that Flanagan is a big fan of King because he not only adapted Gerald's Game, but also Dr. Sleep, the sequel to The Shining, which came out in 2020. And if you haven't seen that, by the way, if you were like missold on the idea of a Shining sequel, I highly recommend seeking it out. For what it's worth, I think that Midnight Mass is much more like Dr. Sleep than it is like The Haunting of Hill House or Bly Manor, despite not being a movie and being a TV series like the latter. But we'll get into that as we go on. The opening episode of the show is very much about establishing Crockett Island and also Riley's relationship with his family and the people who live there. It's a really rich setting, and every character kind of has their own story, and there's lots of complex social dynamics going on. The economy of the island was basically dashed by a large oil spill a few years before, and while fishing has resumed, the correlating kind of like period of time where they couldn't fish and the quotas and how much they can fish has really started to decimate that industry. To make matters worse, they got a settlement from the oil company, which a lot of people took and have now left the island. So their community is very much dying out. In fact, Riley's mum describes the island as not a community, but a ghost, as in it's already dead, people just don't realise it. And there's this kind of sense of unfinished business, I guess, if you want to kind of draw out from that reading. All these reasons why people have to stay, even if they're not particularly good reasons, they are these emotional motivations for them to be there. And a huge part of that is religion, which plays a massive role on the island. The community kind of revolves around this small Catholic church, what they get up to, the charities they support, the events they put on, and its long-running Monsignor, who's been there for years and is in his dotage. And his right-hand woman is this kind of slippery character called Bev Keane, who is pretty horrible to a lot of people in town, but ultimately has a kind of stranglehold because of her links to the religion and to the Monsignor. She particularly comes to blows with the new sheriff, who's played by Rahul Kohli, because he's Muslim, basically. And religion permeates every other aspect of the story, really, from its title, which obviously is a very religious kind of reference, to the names of the episodes, which are named after books in the Bible, to the soundtrack, which, when it's not being an abstract kind of percussion-led, quite unsettling sound, uses a lot of Christian choral music. And it's important to keep that in mind when you're watching it, because it starts to explain a lot of what goes on in it and how the characters act, because they're acting basically on faith, but not just blindly. They're acting on faith because they believe that faith sustains their community. And you can see that in the fact that when Father Paul arrives, who no one knows is coming and is kind of a surprise to everyone because they're waiting for the Monsignor, they essentially take him at his word. And in part that's because his new charismatic preaching seems to offer something like a kind of new lease of life to a community that's essentially dying out. There's another big spectre that looms over the story, and that's alcoholism, which reflects Mike Flanagan's own struggles with addiction and his ultimate sobriety. There's so many characters in the story whose lives have been touched by addiction and by alcohol and by the kind of tragic consequences in their lives. And there's some very clear examples of that, like the drink driving that kicks off the plot with Riley, but also a lot of characters talk about the role that alcohol has played in the lives of their parents, for instance, or even in their own lives in terms of turning away from the consequences of what they're doing, or even just acting terribly, basically. As a condition of his bail, Riley attends AA meetings, and initially that means going to the mainland, and then Father Paul quite quickly cottons on and puts on an AA meeting in the church. Of course, Riley is the only attendee, so it's really a two-hander, these kind of little philosophical plays almost that are peppered throughout the show. And it's here where we see these two characters sparring, not just about these big, sprawling philosophical ideas, and the themes of what's going on in the show more broadly, but also in these kind of character conflicts, in the differences that they have between them in terms of their approach to faith, community, and all sorts of other topics as well. Riley is quite literally haunted by what he did, and a lot of the early kind of scares in the first two episodes are to do with him having these visions of this teen girl that he killed in a drink driving accident. He goes to bed, he lies down on his side, and then as the world kind of slips away, she's there in front of him, lying on the same orientation as he is, floating halfway in the room, with these little bits of glass studded in her face, covered in blood, from going through the windshield, I assume. There's this amazing touch that Flanagan does where you can see the police lights kind of glinting off these little sparks of glass in her face. It's such a striking visual, and also a typically Flanagan visual, I think, because it takes this traumatic event and turns it into a horror element that nevertheless reflects some kind of inner turmoil in the character who experiences it. Now, you might have noticed that I've talked very little about the horror elements of the show overall, and in part that's because I want to avoid spoilers, because a lot of the horror stuff doesn't happen until later on, and I think it's something that you could be forgiven almost for feeling is like more of a drama than a horror, especially for the first few episodes. I think if you're a horror viewer who's used to something with more regular scares in it, like big scare chords, jump scares, that kind of thing, James Wan style stuff, then this won't be for you. And I think it's even slower than, say, The Haunting of Hill House or Bly Manor, in part because it has a much more naturalistic tone to it. By which I mean that if you think about Hill House, it has this really complicated timeline and structure where you're seeing events and then jumping back and forwards to focus on different characters and working out what their perspective on the events are. But in and amongst that, you have a ghost basically every 10 minutes. And it's just not the case here. It's much more of a slow burn. And that's accentuated by the fact that there's lots of long takes in the show, by which I mean that the camera is kind of left running, that the camera follows around the characters. And it's not the showy sort of long takes that you see again in Hill House, for instance, in that famous episode where it's kind of moving through different time periods between the house and the morgue, between the kids and the adults and back and forward. No, it's much more like we're just going to have the camera follow the characters around while they talk to each other. And a lovely aspect of that is that it actually gives lots of space for the characters to come through, for the actors to kind of build up these portrayals over a long period of time. Flanagan's working with his kind of typical posse. You'll see a lot of those recurring faces from the cast of the Haunting stuff and from Dr. Sleep as well. Kate Siegel, who also happens to be Flanagan's wife, has a very prominent role as a kind of old love interest of Riley. And you'll also see Henry Thomas, who played the dad in Hill House and the uncle in Bly Manor, as well as Rahul Kohli, who was the cook in Bly Manor, and there's quite a few more as well. But yeah, plenty of his old hands. And it's a typically Flanagan story in the sense that what he does with these long takes is allow those layers of backstory to slowly get peeled away. And so instead of being presented with a lot of exposition heavy stuff, we meet these characters kind of in the middle of their everyday lives. And over the course of the episodes, we start to find out more about them. It starts to illuminate not only why they're doing what they're doing, but also how they feel about it. This is getting a bit loose, so I'll give you an example. In the first episode, after his first time going back to church, Riley is walking back and sees his old flame, Rachel, played by Kate Siegel. So he runs up to her and walks her home. And there is a shot watching them kind of talking, following them during a sunset as they kind of catch up with each other and find out basically what's happened in the, 15 years since they've seen each other. And that shot is about 3 or 4 minutes long. You know, it's an unbroken bit of performance that's put in there. And it's part of, again, why I feel this is more naturalistic than the other shows that he's done, because it feels sometimes like you're watching something almost like a play, where you're watching lots of dialogue just unfolding between these people. There's another really striking example of that again at the start of the second episode. There's a shot that's, I think, 6.5 minutes long, and it's quite a bit showier, it moves around a lot, and it's related to a very strong horror element at that point. But again, it's just characters talking to each other and kind of laying out this backstory and political kind of undertones of what everyone's talking about within the town. So like I said, for the first 2 episodes, barring a few scares here and there, you could almost be forgiven for thinking that it's actually just a plain drama. But make no mistake, it is a horror through and through, and those slow burns just make those fantastical horror elements all the more electrifying when they finally show up. You've been having these kind of relatively grounded conversations, and then when a storm sweeps through the island in the first episode, Riley thinks he sees this mysterious figure running down the beach, and it's this kind of force of nature moment that's really terrifying because there's something that shouldn't be there. And there's another moment where an aerial shot of the island that seems to be just kind of an establishing exterior, suddenly the camera swoops down into the town and starts stalking around, looking at people, looking in houses and seeing people walking down the street. And you get a sense that the characters can almost feel something at the corner of their vision. And it's those moments where you can really feel your skin crawl. It's much more about that kind of horror than it is about jump scares or big ideas. Well, for the first 2 episodes, but again, I'm not getting into spoilers. Just let it be known for the record that Midnight Mass is absolutely a horror, but it's also a slow burn drama at the same time. And if it feels like it's going a little too slow, sit back, slow down, pay attention. It's not filler, it's deliberate. So I think that's about as far as I can go without spoiling anything, and I've not even really explained what goes on in these episodes, these first 2 episodes. In about a week's time, I'll put up another video and analysing kind of the deeper themes of the show and talking a lot more about spoiler stuff. So keep your eye out for that, and really enjoy watching Midnight Mass in the meantime. And I'd love to hear your thoughts and feelings on Midnight Mass, so do let me know in the comments once you've watched these first couple of episodes and we can have a chat about it. I think it's going to be a really thought-provoking and maybe even kind of divisive response to this, so I'm interested to see what people think. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Alexia is a dancer at car shows. She's a star performer, writhing on bonnets like she really means it. Which actually she does. When she's alone, we see her have sex with a car, a particular flame-decaled vehicle that bucks up on its hydraulics in the throes of passion. In the morning, there's a problem. She's pregnant, apparently carrying the car's child. That is the frankly batshit premise of Titan, the art house horror directed by Raw director Julia Ducournau, which took Cannes by storm this year and won the Palme d'Or. It's not hard to see why, because after a disconcerting opening, the next shot is this long, bravura Steadicam sequence that tours a car show, looking with equal interest at these half-naked women dancing around with lots of stuff on display, and also the inner workings of high-performance cars. And I think the comparison that Ducournau is asking us to make is pretty clear. She's saying that for some people, these are both objects of passion or of interest. And that comparison is really personified in Alexia, who has a titanium plate in her head. That's where the name comes from, which stems from a childhood car accident, which apparently is also where her love of cars has come from. After her tryst with the car, Alexia undergoes a series of stunning transformations, having apparently already killed a bunch of people, which really tells you how much plot is stuffed into this movie, at least in the first 30 minutes. She goes on a further spree of violence, and then in a bid to hide her identity, she roughly cuts her hair, and then shaves her eyebrows off and breaks her own nose. She then binds her breast and her kind of pregnancy belly to pass as a man, and tries to pass herself off as, I think maybe it's kind of spoilery to tell you, but yeah, she takes a particular individual who she passes herself off as, apparently with some success, although it's not clear exactly how much. But all of these transformations are really physically difficult and ruinous to her body. The pregnancy and the binding leads to these long scars and stretch marks that crisscross her body, and she starts to leak motor oil from her genitals and from her nipples. These really transgressive images, I think, like really disturbing to watch, that unfold in this kind of cavalcade of brutality throughout the film. And ultimately, I'm not sure exactly what I'm supposed to take from that. But then again, not all great bits of art have to have a direct meaning that's being communicated to the viewer. Sometimes it's okay to sit back and notice things, just to look at the voice of the filmmaker or of the artist. I noticed, for example, that Alexia is haunted by flames. She has sex with this flame-decaled vehicle, she burns down her house, she ends up finding a kind of tenuous new home with a group of firefighters. Now, I don't know what that means, but I appreciate Ducournau turning her attention towards it, and therefore turning my attention towards it. Maybe it's that fire, while destructive, is also a natural and lively force. Maybe it's that it's something that both destroys and creates. Maybe it's because it's powerful and changeable, like Alexia. I don't know, but I do appreciate that Ducournau is creating these images and then offering them to the viewer with ample room for interpretation. And as far as I'm concerned, in the best possible way, your guess is as good as mine. And it's worth noting that in the middle of all this is Alexia, who is played in a stunning debut by Agatha Roussel. I hope she has a big career ahead of her. She brings a believable cold passion to the violence of the film, and also a surprising and complex tenderness as she scrambles to make sense of what's happening in her life as it changes so quickly. And in that performance, despite all the spectacle and weird stuff going on, she is the film's best special effect, because she grounds its fantastical elements in this agony of her own making. That's it from me, but as ever, I would love to hear your thoughts on this probably very divisive movie, so let's have a chat in the comments down below. And while I've got you, I have a Patreon, just so you know. If you liked this review and you want indietrix to remain free of manscaping adverts or shitty anime t-shirt adverts, then consider supporting me on Patreon. It costs about as much as buying a coffee for yourself. Have a good one, and bye for now.
Hi.
How's your film?
Good.
Did you avoid the temptation to be obvious?
I think so.
That's all you can hope for, isn't it?
Film student Julie is struggling to come to terms with the sudden death of her boyfriend, Anthony. Supported by her mother and friends, she begins to process her grief through the creation of her graduate film, a thinly veiled fictionalization of their complex relationship.
I just wanted to ask you a few questions about Anthony. make a memorial for him.
The Souvenir was one of my favourite films of 2019. This deliberately paced, tragic drama full of wry character observation and intriguing bits of auto-fiction. And it's that last element that really comes to the fore in this sequel. Consumed with grief, Julie only really has space for Anthony in her head, and so she ditches her social realist aspirations and builds on his ideas about how important grand old Hollywood musicals were to create this surreal grad film that riffs off beats of their relationship. Unsurprisingly, this difficult emotional territory makes for a very fraught production. But of course, we're not just talking about Julie's film here, we're talking about Joanna Hogg's film. And she drew very heavily on elements of her own life and tragedies that had happened to her to make that first movie. And so this is as much about Julie reflecting on the events of that film as it is about Joanna Hogg reflecting on fictionalizing that part of her life. Honestly, I was a bit worried about this reflexivity going in. It sounded kind of like Charlie Kaufman shit, and I just wasn't really there for that, especially because what really drew me to The Souvenir was what I felt was very authentic emotion and honesty about character at the heart of it. In reality, the film is quite jarring in lots of ways, especially compared to the previous movie, but it is in a controlled way. And in particular, we see Hogg really experimenting with different forms of film that she hasn't really touched on in her narrative work. The hazy 16mm look that a lot of the first movie had is pretty much absent here. There's some of it, but not much. We're much more likely to see this transition into crisp digital imagery, mirroring Julie and her mates kind of playing with the very 80s high camp advertising and music video promotional imagery. And to go with that, there's this jukebox soundtrack of well-known pop hits that cuts in and out during tracks without much warning, which kind of sets the audience up for something comforting and provides context, but ultimately pulls the former away. Now, The Souvenir Part 1 was a very interesting movie in Hogg's filmography because it played with form as well, and she used stuff like 8mm film that was from her actual archives as part of that, for instance. But for me, that felt like her trying to say something about how memory functions. But here, those aesthetic devices are distancing devices. She's trying to push the viewer away from this emotional story. And it's that approach that makes Part 2 a much less satisfying experience than Part 1. Which I think is entirely intended. You see, Part 1 is this self-contained emotional story, and Part 2 is a sprawling intellectual essay. I think almost like Part 2 was a bad subtitle because it's not really a sequel to the first film so much as it is a bit of critical discourse about the themes and ideas of the first film. Which probably sounds awfully dry, and I certainly think you could say that this film is for Hogg more than it is for an audience. But it's not true that the film is completely lacking emotion. And one of the nice things that happens in this movie is that it draws a lot more on Tilda Swinton, who is playing the mother to Julie, who of course is played by her real life daughter, Honor Swinton Byrne. Tilda, I'm not on first name terms with her, but I'll call her that because otherwise I'll use Swinton for her kid. Tilda is much more heavily utilised in this film, and she has this really sweetly observed and I think quite fragile in some ways mother. She's an endless source of surprise in the movie. She has this kind of interior strength while also seeming sort of brittle, like easily worried is the way that I'd put it. In one of the film's most touching images, Tilda's character has made this little sugar pot in an introduction to ceramics class that she's taking at a local college. It's this beautiful and understated counterpoint to her daughter's very fraught relationship with her own art. You know, the mum has gone into this early course, made something sort of semi-instinctually, and it is just a complete artifact, imperfections and all. Whereas her daughter is desperately trying to take very complex real-life feelings and is unsuccessfully trying to distill them into a short film. Both women have moments in the film where they observe the other vulnerable, unknown, unaware that they're being watched. And then instead of directly talking to each other about it, they find other ways to comfort each other. And when they do talk directly, it's almost not emotional. It's like matter of fact. And there's something incredibly powerful about the way that relationship is portrayed in the film. The other major returning face from the first movie, where he was really just a cameo, is Richard Ayoade, who plays this pompous director that Julie kind of is vaguely aware of, in the social circles of, and sort of looks up to, I suppose, in some ways. He really shines and, to be honest, steals scenes as this nasty guy, really, who is so invested in his own idea of what film is and has these really complex visions, but is apparently like completely unable to communicate that properly, despite being very decisive. And in that sense, he's an interesting foil to Julie, who has this intensely personal, but quite insecure and indecisive filmmaking style. And I should also point out the much less well-known but fantastic Ariana Labed, who was in Attenberg, which is a really good Greek movie, and Jagan Ayer as the schoolmates of Julie, who are quite small roles in terms of the actual plot of the film, but are very present in a lot of the scenes. And they're very like warm and funny performances, but also they're sort of challenging to Julie at points in ways that really illuminates the story. So it's not the first one, but who would want it to be? Reflecting the stylistic ambition of its predecessor while interrogating its intellectual, moral and ethical beats, The Souvenir Part 2 is a distinctive and engaging sequel. Hope you enjoyed watching my review, and just wanted to point it out in case you didn't know that I actually have a Patreon. So if you've enjoyed watching my videos over the years, or maybe you're a new subscriber who likes my style, if you want to help keep indietrix free of ads and free of editorializing, then you can support me for as much as a coffee a month. And now that the shilling's out of the way, let's have a chat in the comments below about this fascinating movie. Have a good one. Bye for now.
How high can you count?
300.
Okay, I want you to count to 600. I'll be back.
1, 2.
Malik knows the secret truth. Microscopic parasites descending to Earth in meteorites are infesting life across the planet, manipulating their hosts to nefarious ends. Armed with this knowledge, he enacts a rescue mission to retrieve his estranged kids at any cost. Playing off countless sci-fi conceits about the righteous lone man fighting back against an alien conspiracy, Encounter poses a more disturbing interpretation. What if these beliefs were delusional? How would a father react in that situation? What would he do to his family? This tense thriller from Beast director Michael Pearce offers no easy answers to that question. Malik is a very layered character, and Ahmed's performance peels back those layers one by one so that we can really see what's going on in his psychology. He's charismatic and loving enough to be the hero of his own story, but he's also got a quick anger that makes his kids wonder if maybe he's the villain. Despite its hooky premise, the film actually largely follows the structure of a character drama in much the same way that Beast did, where it was basically set up like a thriller but was really about the relationship between two people. And here, instead of lovers, we have this very strong family relationship where Malik and his kids are basically just in a car on a road trip for long periods of time. And it's those empty stretches of road where the lush cinematography and really full sound design help flesh the world out. The film's look is tenebrous, which is a really fancy way of saying that it's often pooled in shadow. We see characters' faces half in the dark most of the time. And there are these really striking and clever kind of compositions where on a big empty road, for instance, you'll see headlights driving away and then slowly dwindling into the distance until they become pinpricks in an otherwise almost black screen, much like the stars that Malik is obsessed with, that he's having visions of. And the way those visions are treated is really interesting because the film actually starts with them as if they were real. We see a meteor coming into Earth's atmosphere, we see dust in the shafts of light in a forest, we see bugs covered in this dust biting each other, and then we see a man sleeping and a mosquito piercing into his bloodstream and this little parasite getting in. So we go from this really cosmic view to this skin-crawling bug stuff and then right down into the inner space before Malik wakes up. And I think that's a powerful approach in terms of taking the concept seriously because you're inviting the audience into that headspace. Now, as I said, the movie's strongest idea is playing off audience expectations with this apparent like lead protagonist type, this ex-Marine who's charismatic and fun half of the time, kind of maybe posing a danger to his kids. But interestingly, we also get an almost equal focus on the kids, particularly the eldest of the two, who is called Jay. And Jay is really very much in love with his dad. He thinks that he's the greatest guy on earth and he trusts him. And so he accepts this new worldview quickly, kind of without questioning. And a lot of the film's narrative is about the beginnings of questioning that, of thinking maybe Dad's not right, and is he okay? But what really surprised me was how tender that story ended up being. Instead of being a straightforward plot about two kids who are abducted and their crazy dad, like a Criminal Minds episode or something, it's a much more thoughtful and moving relationship between those two characters. That's not to say that it's perfect. In fact, there's one character who really gets short shrift, which is Octavia Spencer's bounty hunter, who kind of failed to identify Malik as a flight risk and now feels responsible for whatever's going to happen at the end of this road. If you ask me, that's an interesting storyline, and she does kind of get her own investigation plot, but it doesn't really go anywhere, and it doesn't seem to tie much into the main movie. It feels curiously curtailed, is the way that I would describe it, like it was supposed to be longer in the original script or even in the actual original edit, and was cut for time or because it distracted from that admittedly very beautiful central relationship and its portrayal. But that's pretty much my only note, so go and see Encounter. It's a richly layered, edge-of-your-seat, nail-biting thriller, as well as a really closely observed character drama about a family living on the whims of delusion. So that's it from me, but let's have a chat in the comments below. I think there's a lot of room to interpret this movie in different ways and talk about the way that it plays with tropes that often feel quite tired. I was slightly disappointed by the marketing for the movie because I think it largely portrays it as a straightforward like sci-fi action thing, and in reality it's a much more complex story. So I think it'll probably bore some people who wanted to go in for that kind of popcorn action. But I'm hoping that there is an audience that finds the film, and maybe word of mouth will help with that. I don't know. But let's chat about that in the comments below. What fruitful area for discussion. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
It began as a holiday. Eager to escape a bright future on the Great Plains, Arthur Howitzer Jr. transformed the series of travelogue columns into the French Dispatch.
In 1975, legendary magazine The French Dispatch of the Liberty, Kansas Evening Sun is printing its last issue after the death of editor Arthur Howitz Jr. That's a jumping off point for a dive into the magazine's wild past in the form of 3 stories. The relationship between an incarcerated artist, his muse and his agent, a love affair between an older reporter and a young protester during student riots, and a food review turned police stakeout. The French Dispatch is set in the fictional town of Ennui, introduced in a brief opening segment with Owen Wilson. That places it in a particular canon of Anderson films, along with The Darjeeling Limited and Isle of Dogs, in that it's a film about a place that isn't America. More like the latter, Isle of Dogs, than the former. The depiction of France in The French Dispatch is basically a caricature. I mean, despite Anderson living there for much of his adult life, we're looking at a cartoon sketch of the place, set in a made-up city named after a French word that most English-speaking audiences will know. Whether you find that charming or insulting will predict your reaction to most of the rest of the film. Now, anthology movies can be a bit taxing on both the viewer and the reviewer because they require a lot of recap. And adding to that issue, Anderson's document madness that's run through all of his movies escalates even further in this film. Characters aren't just sending each other cutesy letters anymore. The very structure of the story itself is communicated through documents of various types. Benicio del Toro's Tortured Artist is narrated through a framing lecture delivered by Tilda Swinton years later, and Jeffrey Wright's food writing is recited verbatim during a TV interview way after the fact. A large chunk of that story actually is also told through a comic book adaptation of its already historically distant events. Throughout all of these shifts, aspect ratios change, lengthening or compressing the image, and more bewilderingly, I think, the film changes regularly between black and white and colour, sometimes shot to shot, sometimes during the same sequence, with no discernible reason. Now, aesthetic distancing devices are nothing new for Anderson. I mean, how much more obvious can you be with your distancing when your trademark is a wide-angle lens? But in this case, they distance the viewer from the actual story itself, from the literal telling of it, not just the subtext. For me, this is the most interesting and freshest aspect of the film by far. Your mileage may vary, just like it did on Ennui itself. Look, it's a Wes Anderson movie, right? He's been doing them for years. He successfully built a brand around taking the charming bits of the 90s indie film scene and making it look like a stellar advert for the Tumblr generation. We all know it, and some of us even like it. I'm hit and miss with his stuff personally. I find it a bit weird that a large portion of the film criticism world fawns over this guy who mostly directs adverts and writes reductive movies about another culture based off his favourite New Yorker articles. But hey, it's a Wes movie, and what I'm saying is, you know what you're getting. For me, I like it when there's something underneath all of that style, and preferably not just a sad dad figure. The Grand Budapest Hotel, to me, represents all that Wes Anderson can promise, using a cavalcade of aesthetic approaches to mask this moving story about totalitarianism and its impact on human lives. The big trouble with The French Dispatch is that despite all the lovingly rendered documents, the big name cast, the baguettes and onions and striped shirts, underneath it all, there's not really much there. Wright's story carries this core moment of beautiful pathos, but the telling of it's too whimsical to really land. Del Toro's story might be emotional, but we aren't given enough time to appreciate it because of the anthology structure. And the middle story, with the boy himself, Timothée Chalamet, is more of a whisper than a bang. It's a Wes movie, yes, but Wes has moved into his decadent phase, running out of fresh ideas, reproducing and reinterpreting his own, parodying himself without seemingly realising it. So that's The French Dispatch, but I know Wes Anderson has his fans, and boy are they diehard, so let's have that debate in the comments below. I'd love to see what you thought about this movie. And hey, if you didn't know, I have a Patreon that supports indietrix, so if you enjoyed this review, if you like the fact that it's impartial and doesn't have adverts for shaving equipment or like subscription boxes that give you vegetables, then please head on over and consider supporting me on Patreon. It costs about as much as a coffee. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Eloise moves from her sleepy Cornwall home to London, pursuing her dream to make it as a fashion designer. But London isn't how her retro 60s fantasies imagined it. Cliquey girls, loud parties, and modern fashions are hard for her to navigate. So when she finds a quiet bedsit in the heart of Soho, it seems to be a dream come true. Except every night when she falls asleep, she's propelled into the past, watching the story of glamorous Sandy and charming Jack play out against a swinging 60s backdrop. This much anticipated Edgar Wright film is a bit of a departure from his previous work. It feels more straightforward, less concerned with Byzantine callbacks and calls forward, and more with telling its own horrific little story. Of course, there's still a poppy soundtrack, tricksy edits, and plenty of references to other movies. He's not suddenly become Ari Aster, Robert Eggers, or whatever, but it's more grounded. Presumably drawing on Wright's own experiences as a kid from the sleepy southwest who came to London, Eloise's journey towards her dreams feels heartfelt. We first meet her dancing in this newspaper prototype dress that she's made in a retro fashion, and she's singing along to this 60s pop track. And then she sees her late mother in the mirror, reflected there, this ghost, our first inkling of her links with the afterlife. This character is a combination of quirky and gifted, and I think that's something that can often be quite annoying. But it really works here because of Thomasin McKenzie's winning performance. Plus, she has an excellent Cornish accent, so top marks from me. Quite quickly, it becomes apparent that London isn't what Eloise hoped it to be. She's lumped in with this awful woman called Jocasta, who's like the housemate from hell, this acerbic gap year haute couture wannabe who's very well realised by a relative newcomer called Synnøve Karlsson. I hope I pronounced that right. She's got a line through one of the O's, and I've honestly never known quite what to do with those, so sorry, Miss Karlsson, if I mispronounce your name. Eloise doesn't fit well with the culture of drinking or designer clothes, and so she's pretty much alienated from the group, except for John, who's this very sweet guy who gets probably the biggest laugh in the whole film. And it's a great role, by the way, for Michael Adjau, whose eagle-eyed viewers might recognise as the kid Mayhem from Attack the Block. What an intervening decade it's been for him and his co-stars, like John Boyega in that film. I really liked seeing a film with a university setting that doesn't portray hard partying as the only way to live. It's a good portrait of just how hard it can be to settle in that environment. And while there's plenty to say about the film's reconstruction of its 60s setting, I was very happy to see modern London well represented as well. In particular, much of the film's major moments revolve around the Toucan pub in Soho, which is a real drinking spot that I'm pretty sure will be rammed with tourists for months and maybe years to come. Once her dreams begin, Eloise is brought into Sandy's swing 60s London, and here's the film at its most dazzling, a note-perfect evocation of the glamour of that particular time and place. Sandy and Eloise swap places in this dizzying dance number, and Eloise watches through mirrors as she meets Jack, who's a bit of a gangster. So armed with images and overconfidence from those dreams, Eloise is able to start growing her self-esteem in the waking world. But it's an illusory confidence, cribbed from someone else. And one of the film's most effective ideas is comparing these two women's dreams of London versus its realities. Because of course, as it turns out, London in the 1960s was in many ways just as grim as it can be today, as both Eloise and Sandy find out. Now, our press screening came with an explicit request from Edgar Wright not to discuss the final third, which I will mostly respect here. If you take a look at Wright's BFI season, which is currently showing all of the films that influenced The Last Night in Soho, you'll see plenty of leery Soho backstreet movies with fallen women and shiny suited gangsters. If you follow those influences, you'll find no big surprises here. I will add that the final third of the film doesn't match up to the focus and strength of ideas that precede it, and have elements that I think will make it a troubling watch for those who are triggered by themes around sexual coercion. The film becomes very muddled, particularly in its politics, and it really drags quite a bit. Despite all its glamour and time travel, Last Night in Soho is really a ghost story, and a good one at that. Wright and co-writer Krysty Wilson-Cairns understand that ghost stories are at their heart about history, ways of reflecting our wonders about those who came before us, tapping into the past and finding the sometimes hidden pain there. For Eloise, that's about the life of another woman. For Wright, Last Night in Soho is obviously doing something similar, but for him as a filmmaker, plunging into the style and ideas of some of his favourite films. That's it from me, but I can't wait to find out what you thought about Edgar Wright's Last Night in Soho. Let's have a chat in the comments below. Have a good one, and bye for now. The Eternals, an ancient group of super beings who came to Earth to safeguard humanity's development, have scattered across the modern-day world. But when a threat from our distant past returns, they're forced to gather together and to face their differences. If that description sounds kind of generic, it's because The Eternals is both very difficult to synopsize and also kind of dumb. So with that said, let's just say there's going to be spoilers ahead. If you haven't seen the film, don't watch the video unless you don't care about spoilers. I would recommend, by the way, to not watch the film, so spoilers for me would be fine, but that's just my opinion. You have the right to make up your own mind. And yeah, let's sit and dunk on the worst movie that Marvel's made yet. There's always a future, there's always worse stuff they could do. First of all, a bit of background information, because I think it helps set the scene. If you didn't know, the Eternals were the brainchild of one of the most influential comic book creators, Jack Kirby, who made a huge bracing of characters where you would recognize loads of them. And Kirby always had a kind of mystical and spacefaring style to his work. So it's no wonder that he made not only one story about ancient super beings coming to Earth, the Eternals, but actually two, because he also wrote New Gods for DC. You know, Darkseid and all that kind of stuff. Kirby's work is incredibly distinctive, but it's also super weird and very cosmic, and so it's not been exactly priority to be adapted into the silver screen. And I personally, as someone who's read comics for like my entire life, had no idea what the Eternals were until Marvel announced they were going to do a movie about them. So I went and read Neil Gaiman's maxi-series reboot of the comic, which was made in the early noughties with John Romita Jr. doing some of the art. And I actually have to say, I liked it. You know, I'm not a huge fan of Kirby and this kind of cosmic stuff. I think superheroes should have some kind of grounded element. But I actually really liked Gaiman's adaptation of it. And the fun thing about that maxi-series is that it essentially asks, you know, where have the Eternals been? Why haven't they been getting involved in society? You know, why have they allowed all these crimes to happen on Earth? And in the case of the MCU, I think that's a really interesting question to ask, what with Thanos and stuff like that. In Gaiman's version of the story, all of these characters are on Earth, but they don't know they're Eternals. They've all got amnesia. They seem to have deliberately gotten rid of their memories. And so when they start to reconnect with each other, we get to see them recast in interesting ways. You know, one of the characters who has the ability to hypnotize people has become the press secretary for a totalitarian Eastern European state. Stuff like that. And it's a really interesting take. It's very modern, it's very streamlined, and you know, like it or lump it, I think Marvel have built a very effective brand around doing just that. Taking some of their weirder ideas, streamlining them down, and placing them in a modern context that can be instantly accessible to cinema audiences. So imagine my surprise when the opening minutes of this film not only essentially say, hey, buckle up, we're going on a deep dive of the weirdest lore we've ever done, but in fact that information is literally described through an opening crawl. The laziest most hackneyed trope of exposition possible, one that's so ancient that it may as well have been invented by the Eternals. So we get this opening crawl where all of the lore is explained, this huge dump of exposition, and then we see this curiously bloodless fight scene where the characters fight off the Deviants. The Deviants are the characters who they've come to Earth to destroy. In the comics, they are these really goofy-looking kind of human types. They're supposed to be kind of corrupted humans. I think that's something that politically might be a bit uncomfortable nowadays, but it's something that Kirby did, again, quite a lot of with New Gods and stuff like that. And weirdly, this is basically the only thing they streamline from the lore, because they've turned these characters into just like grey monsters. And so we have this very long fight sequence without much dialogue. I think, in fact, there may be no dialogue in this sequence, where we meet all of these individual Eternals. It's an all-star cast, and they're all named after random gods from our prehistory, so I don't really have the ability to name all of those characters. And in fairness, they each get their own individual kind of quirk and some individualization of power sets, but we don't really get stories for most of these characters. We just get a bit of information about them. Now, there's been a lot of excitement in the Marvel fandom about Chloe Zhao coming to direct one of these movies. You'll know her from having won an Oscar this year for Nomadland. She also made some really amazing indie films like The Rider and Songs My Brother Taught Me. The first one actually didn't get a release in the UK at all, so no wonder you haven't seen it. The Rider is available online some places, and I highly recommend you see it. Zhao's whole trademark as a director really is working with almost entirely non-actors, working on stories that are quite closely linked to their life, and in the case of The Rider, essentially fictionalizing a real episode from the main character's life. And she's also famous for a visual style that's kind of reminiscent of Terrence Malick, that's developed with the camera operator / director of photography, a British guy called Joshua James Richards. Now, I say there was excitement about her being involved in this film. I guess that's, to me, kind of naive. I've never really felt watching these Marvel movies, particularly after Phase 1, that they felt distinctively the work of any of the particular directors that they were from. I think the exception you could make for that is probably Taika Waititi, who, to be fair, has a style that's so similar to the kind of banter-led comedy of all the rest of the MCU that I don't really know that's that distinctive, to be frank. But basically, the modus operandi of making these films is that the director shoots the 40 minutes or so of conversation in the movie, and then the rest of it is shot by a second unit. If you look at the second unit, they're basically the same across all of the Marvel films, and that's what happens here. So in some ways, this doesn't feel like a Chloe Zhao film at all, in likelihood because the vast majority of the film was not shot by her. Joshua James Richards, this cinematographer that she works with, did actually work on the film, but as a camera operator. The stalwart kind of MCU cinematographer Ben Davis, who shot I think 4 or 5 of their movies now, he works on the film as the cinematographer. I'm guessing the relationship on set was like Chloe Zhao talks to Josh, and then Josh tells everyone else about what to do, and Ben then filters that down as a management kind of level position. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make here is that I was not excited to go in and see a Chloe Zhao Marvel film, because in reality I felt like we would not get a Chloe Zhao Marvel film. Now, I was quite surprised to find that it did feel like a Chloe Zhao film in certain ways, but almost all of those ways are bad, unfortunately. The biggest problem is that her wide-angle, natural light style of shooting stuff is very floaty and is really good in like an independent film setting where you're looking at character studies, because you're watching the frame unfold, you're understanding about the place they're in, you have the time to settle and sort of analyze the frame. But that's not really what you want from an action movie sometimes, and you see that very early on in these fight sequences where the camera will just kind of float around following people and you don't get any weight to the CGI. It feels dull and floaty, which might also be because the design of the monsters and the way they move is also dull and floaty, and in the case of the characters, they are both dull and they can float, so that might be other reasons why, but the cinematography was what really stood out to me there. So after this ancient opening, we cut to modern day London, and I was quite happy for once to see a depiction of London that wasn't just the 4 streets in the financial district that they always film in. Instead, we cut to Camden Lock, where there's a big fight there. It's this famous site in northwest London, and then Gemma Chan, who's like the lead of the film, Cersei, goes on a quest with her mate Sprite and with her ex-boyfriend Icarius, and then they go on this globe-trotting adventure around the world where, despite kind of traveling to all these different places, almost all of the shots are mid-wides showing the same 6 people's faces. What are you going to do? At least the backgrounds are different. And boy, is it globetrotting, you know. A lot of memes were made about the fact that Kevin Feige was like impressed that Chloe Zhao wanted to shoot in actual physical places to see like blades of grass and stuff and not just be on a green screen the whole time. Although again, to be clear, I'm pretty sure most of this was done on lots of green screen. And yeah, they go basically everywhere, a slightly questionable amount of locations really in a very short period of time. They go from London to South Dakota to India to Australia to South America, and then somewhere in the Indian Ocean, I think, after that for the finale of the film, which does seem like quite a wide distance to cover, especially when you consider that I don't believe all of the characters can fly. The real proper action doesn't kick in until almost an hour and a half into the movie. There's like a really long action sequence in a forest, which actually is probably the best bit of the movie. It probably is the only bit that really felt to me like it had any sort of identifiable stakes or like stuff going on that wasn't just floaty monsters fighting each other. And underneath that whiz-bang globe-trotting journey with all of its like quips and all these characters, there isn't really a story. And what do I mean when I say a story? I guess in the broadest possible sense, a story should have like dramatic beats. Should be like a beginning, middle, and end, probably where we find something out in the middle that switches that story over, and where the characters change over the course of it. And I think it's that latter thing that this movie really struggles with, weirdly in a similar way to how Captain Marvel failed to really have like a dynamic arc for its actual lead character. There's this huge, unwieldy cast, and while I would say that they're all identifiable, they have their own quirks and things like that, none of them really get that much focus. There's not much of an individual story for any of them. And I think that's the problem with having a team movie that introduces so many characters at once, which is one of many criticisms of the original Justice League cut that I think you could apply to this. And it's certainly interesting to see like all of the critical reaction to that and then compare it across to this, because I think in reality they have almost exactly the same problems. So to give you some concrete examples of how I think characters are underdeveloped in the film, and there's some weird pacing choices as well as a result of this, or sometimes causing these problems. There's an actor called Lauren Ridloff who plays a character whose name I can't remember in the film. She's deaf, this woman, the actor as well as the character, and the character has super speed. She's like quite a fun presence in the early part of the film, and she's pretty important to another one of the character's story arcs. And then she just disappears from the film for almost half of it. She's introduced in the first like 5-10 minutes, and then she's just not in it for like a large chunk of its runtime. There's another character called Gilgamesh who is kind of super strong, how original, and he is really kind of distinctively important to the plot and has quite big dramatic beats in it, but he doesn't get a spoken line of dialogue in the film as far as I can tell until over an hour into the movie. That seems like a weird choice, but it's a choice that they made in this film. I think teen movies are difficult to write, and there are some established workarounds for it, which they try here. Funnily enough, they do almost exactly the same trick that Joss Whedon tried with Avengers, where instead of really having a team dynamic, he just pairs them off all the time and has them in little pairs. In this, almost all of those pairs are people who are wanting to bang each other. So you have like Gilgamesh, and then you have Angelina Jolie, who he's in love with, maybe, and then we have Lauren Ridloff, and we have Barry Cohen, who's just like trying to do his own weird thing in the middle of this film, and then you've got the leads. And the thing is, I can ignore a bad team arc because I think they are difficult to write. These sprawling teams of people are difficult. You have to give them individual personalities and everything. It's tough. I get that. I can forgive all that if there's a central arc that makes sense. If there's a character arc for Gemma Chan, for Cersei, who's the lead of the film, and also for her lover, who's like the secondary lead, who is Icarius, Richard Madden. And unfortunately, there isn't. Cersei starts off the film being really nice and powerful and kind of well-adjusted and right and in love and having a good time. And then at the end of the film, that's still the case. Everything's the same for her. And her story arc really could be described as like she gets more powerful and more right. And that, to go back to it, really reminded me of Captain Marvel, where essentially the story arc for her is like, she's really awesome, and then she's like, am I awesome? Am I awesome at stuff? Yeah, I am. Watch me do awesome stuff. And it's just flat in a way that isn't really interesting for an audience. It doesn't help, I think, that Gemma Chan is, to me, not a great actor. I know some people really love her work. I always felt like she's got a little bit of the school play about her. And certainly I think she's very wooden here. She has a love interest played by Richard Madden, who I also think is sometimes quite wooden, and here feels very wooden. That's my biggest problem with the acting, by the way, the whole way through this movie. People under-emote a lot in it, and it's hard to tell why. My suspicion is that Zhao was going for like a sort of like a self-conscious godlike feeling where they felt like living statues or something, like these kind of holy beings. But that does not work, just to be clear. Like, there isn't enough emotion in that. So the big pinning behind this is that Richard Madden and Gemma Chan are supposed to be like very deeply in love with each other for thousands of years. And unfortunately, I just don't think they have any chemistry. So all that stuff just feels rough. Something I've seen touted a lot about this film is that it has the first sex scene in a Marvel movie. And I don't think that says much about the emotional honesty of this film. I think it says more about the immense prudishness of American action cinema overall. But there is this sex scene, and it's just like watching Barbies rub together. It's rough because you don't feel those characters have any interest in each other. And I have to compare that to something like Wonder Woman, where Gal Gadot and Chris Pine have a very strong feeling of attraction towards each other. They have good chemistry and they're able to play that off. It makes it fun to be in their company. Whereas here, every time it cut to these flashbacks of them being like a married couple, I was just like, this is the least believable thing in this movie about space gods, and that is a really rough thing for this film as something that's supposed to be human drama. And to be fair, they're dealing with a very rough script, and so they just have to woodenly sort of trot out these clanger lines like, we must end this violent cycle. Isn't the phrase cycle of violence? It's been getting at me since I watched the movie. I feel like you could just do this stuff on another script pass, gang. It would be doable. And likewise, Kumail Nanjiani seems to have not gotten any direction in the film, because he is this really stoic super god in the early parts of the movie, and then when we pick up with him in the modern day, he's become like Kumail Nanjiani, like this kind of joker, just like spewing out quips and doing comic relief. Weirdly, he brings his butler along for the whole film, which only seems to have been just for fun, to make the movie anything other than just really dull to watch. And strangely enough, he just disappears from the ending of the film. He opts out of the final set piece, like literally on screen. He's like, oh, I'm not really interested in it. And then just doesn't show up for 20 minutes at the end, which seems like a weird choice for a teen movie. I was sat there in that final set piece waiting for him to come back, and then he didn't. So thanks, all 5 credited screenwriters on this film that took several years and hundreds of millions of dollars to make. I think the only 2 people who are giving like traditionally good performances in the film are Kit Harington, who essentially just has a cameo in the film, and Angelina Jolie, who doesn't have that big a role, but does get like actual stuff to do. She gets an actual arc to some extent. And yeah, it shows. She just has something to do. The kid who plays Sprite is also pretty good, but hard to judge in a movie of this scope and with lots of different character stuff going on. And of course, all of the character stuff that gets set up in the movie gets thrown out the window halfway through with a 6-7 minute long like exposition dump by one of the main characters that just completely changes the plot. And it's almost to the point where it feels like a screenwriter walking into the movie and saying, hey, we need to do another thing because this isn't anything. Now, after that big shift, we end up with a last third of the movie that tries to deal with big themes. And again, I thought this was not allowed in superhero movies after Zack Snyder. I thought we decided that we weren't allowed to have superhero films talk about interesting stuff. Well, I've always disagreed with that. I think that there is space for superhero movies to touch on deeper themes if you want to. They don't have to, but it can be done. And I think, in fact, that superheroes are quite a good place to talk about stuff like, does might make right? How are politics and power interrelated with each other? What's the weight of our own personal responsibility when we have the ability to do good in the world? I think superheroes are a good site for those sort of conversations. And Eternals, I think, wants to have those conversations. You can almost feel Zhao's influence kind of coming in and saying, God, I want the movie to be about something. But unfortunately, it does that Marvel thing where they talk about the themes a lot, and then at the end, it all just comes down to personal relationship stuff. It has very little to do with what's right or wrong in a cosmic sense, and more to do with like, will you or won't you be my boyfriend/girlfriend? It's the old debate and switch. They do it every time. You don't want to pick a side because that would scare off some of your audience, and you can't be doing that. And yeah, like I said, I thought that it was wrong to talk about those things in these movies. I remember people feeding back about Batman vs Superman saying, like, superhero films shouldn't have Christ allegories in them. They shouldn't have imagery that is reminiscent of terrorist attacks. That seems wrong. And I think those ideas can be in these movies, but I think they should be subtextual and original, which is, I suppose, a roundabout way of saying that I find it deeply upsetting and I think pretty immoral for the filmmakers behind this movie to use the very real atrocities committed in the Second World War, particularly the bombing of Hiroshima, as a backdrop for a character beat in this movie. And I kid you not, it's just like a close-up of one of the main characters crying while looking around at the wreck of Hiroshima and saying like, oh, we should have stopped this. And I don't know about you, but I find that distasteful. I hate really saying that things in films are like morally wrong. I feel like we can have good conversations about art without talking about whether or not the way in which it depicts things is moral or not. But I think we have to draw some line at using an event of massive human suffering and a major watershed moment in human history to underpin the last third of a superhero film made by one of the biggest corporations in the world. Is that too much to ask? I felt the same way about depictions of Auschwitz in X-Men Apocalypse, and I weirdly think that in comparison, the opening of Batman vs Superman, which does, you know, trade in 9/11 imagery and imagery from natural disasters, feels like a better treatment of that kind of material because it is dealing with something within its own fictional universe. And there's the real head scratcher as well with this, is that like there's plenty of things in the Marvel Cinematic Universe that could have been used as a placeholder here. Why talk about something that actually happened in our real world and affected real human lives when you could talk about like the tragedy in Sokovia that happened in the MCU, or you could talk about the blip or the snap or whatever we're calling the thing when Thanos disappeared half the universe. These are all events where the Eternals also decided to not intervene for reasons that ultimately are never really described beyond, well, we just decided not to. And while it's terrible in its own right, I think it also does show a lack of thinking at the heart of the film, a lack of development of the ideas, characters, places, settings, themes of the movie. And that's what causes all of these problems that I've been talking about the whole way through. It's that lack of understanding about the characters and their central journeys. Like I said at the start of this video, whether you like them or not, I think Marvel have actually had their finger on the pop cultural pulse for like 2 decades at this point. I think they've successfully understood what people want, they've defined a formula, and they've delivered it time and time again. And this movie is trying to get out of that formula in a way that is just inexplicable to me. It's like they are deliberately trying to make a film that no one will want to watch. And it's funny too, because I think there maybe would have been a place for this dense 2.5 hours worth of exposition of stellar politics and kind of badly handled religious themes if it wasn't immediately comparable to one of the best films of the year that came out a week before it, which is Dune. Dune really shows that you can cover all that stuff in a blockbuster and do it with finesse and develop the ideas and themes behind it and subtlety visually, and none of that is really present in Eternals anywhere. And I also think there might have been a place for it earlier in the Marvel cycle, if they'd had a chance to bed down these characters into that backstory. But starting where they are now and not using the very good, like, Neil Gaiman miniseries, for instance, as a way of kind of covering their asses, it is weighed down by how much it has to explain about how that universe makes sense with all of what we've seen before. And I think, to be honest, that within Marvel, their confidence was also shaken in the film, because it's the only way that I can understand the fact that, you know, unable to carve out this new niche, they spend their last couple of minutes in this movie setting up the most blatant sequel hooks that Marvel's ever done. And these aren't those fun in-credit Easter eggs that they got famous for, the reason why we all sit and watch the credits now in movies, which by the way you should, because people worked hard and you should read their names even if you're never going to identify who the gaffer was or whatever. Those used to be fun, they used to be an interesting way of linking together these films. And now they feel quite sad to me, they feel desperate, they feel like live pitches to the audience for a movie you might like more than the one you just watched. And most egregiously, I think, the final end credit Easter egg of this shows Kit Harington suddenly not being a normal human, but in fact having a magical heritage at the end of this movie, and then we hear off-screen Blade talking to him, Mahershala Ali, in the new depiction of that character. And I was thinking back to the first Easter egg they did, where Nick Fury, Samuel L. Jackson just showed up at the end of Iron Man, and just how mind-blowing that would have been to see in the cinemas, which unfortunately I missed. It's such a big statement of like authority. Hey, we know you're gonna like this guy, we're bringing this in. And here they don't even show Blade on screen, presumably because they haven't finalized his costume, or they want to save the trailer for the next Comic-Con. And it does feel like a movie that has no confidence in itself. It's emblematic of a problem, I think, as well in the wider MCU. What do we do after the Avengers, who still come up in this? They still have a conversation about them there. I have to be honest, I think you can get all sorts of enjoyment out of all sorts of films, and even very bad films can often be quite instructive to watch. I very rarely finish a movie and think that it was an absolute waste of my personal time. But Eternals absolutely is. I guess the best way to say it is, if you're on a long distance flight and this is the only film available to you, I would say go to sleep instead of watching it, because ultimately the film will drive you to that either way. So that's it from me on Marvel's worst movie yet, but I'd love to see what you thought in the comments below. So let's have a chat about this movie. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Pardon me, I don't mean to stare, but I think I know you.
Claire?
Renee, Tessa Thompson, is on edge when she's out shopping in the upmarket and white districts of New York in the 1920s. Taking a break in a hotel tea room, she's shocked when she's approached by a white woman, and even more shocked to discover that in fact this is her childhood friend Claire, Ruth Negga, who is now passing as white, without her very racist husband knowing anything about it. That inciting incident kicks off this layered and delicate art house drama, which is the debut of director Rebecca Hall, better known as an actor. The title Passing refers most obviously to the race passing that goes on in the film, where Claire is able to masquerade as a white person without even her racist husband knowing about it. And in fact, he actually has a racist nickname for her based purely off his disbelief that she would have any kind of black heritage. Quite quickly, the film starts to interrogate that idea, and there's a long conversation in its opening, really, between these two women about not only the practicalities of passing, but also the ideas and the meaning, the subtext, the politics behind that. But what might surprise you is that title, which is taken from the book of the same name that is being adapted here, is actually a lot more broad than you might think, and the interpretation of passing within the film also relates to the way that class is depicted there and its intersections with race and also with sexuality as well. So just thinking about class, when we meet Tessa Thompson, she's very much out of place in this very upper class, rich, wealthy, and it has to be said, white environment. And then we see her go back to her home and, you know, it turns out to be this very nice, quite well-appointed middle-class house in Harlem. Her husband is a doctor and she has a live-in maid who is also black. And again, it's interesting to note that this woman who's their maid is not only black, but actually has much darker skin than Tessa Thompson's character in the film. So there's almost this kind of colorism being discussed and reflected in there as well. They're quite well known within the society that's going on in Harlem. And there's lots of conversations too about how white people come into that space. It's interesting that Rini refers to Claire as a white person in several scenes throughout the film. And I guess that's because Claire has chosen to present herself as that, but it's also a bit of a sparring match, a bit of a barb between the two of them. All of that is thrown into focus in the very interesting scene that kind of pins the movie together, where this dance that the Negro League is putting on, which Rini has basically organized, is attended by a quite well-known white novelist. And they have this conversation that's very testing and probing, and it's kind of done in this catty literary way, but there are some real feelings underneath there and some real misunderstandings too. And Rini says to this novelist, "We're all passing as one thing or another." And I think that's a real thesis statement for the film and for its treatment of its central themes. I was impressed by how carefully the filmmakers manage those ideas and stop the conversation from becoming didactic. You know, it feels like an open discussion and interpretation of a multi-layered concept of passing. And at the heart of that is this identity crisis that Rini is undergoing. And it's really kicked off by this central discovery that her childhood friend is passing as white, but it encompasses all different kinds of identity. The most striking element of that to me was a kind of implied desire between these two women. And it's something that apparently is subtextual in the original novel, and here it feels very deliberate, but again, it stays completely subtextual. Rini and Claire are both mothers. Sometimes they seem happy with their kids, sometimes they don't. Both of them seem to have fraught relationships with their husbands. In particular, we see quite a lot of Rini's home life, where she's pretty sexually repressed and doesn't seem to have much desire towards her husband, or at least doesn't want to manifest that. What we do get is lots of long hand touches and lingering looks between these two women, where a lot is said without being said. In that dance, when Claire comes back over to the table where Rini sat, she stands by her for a moment, and we see from Rini's point of view just the back of her head, the nape of her neck, and then the camera tracks down her back, down her body. And that seems like a very deliberate playing with this idea that perhaps there's something more between these two women that neither of them are able to express. And so again, we circle back to that idea of passing and the complexity with which we construct our own identities. And that story is told through the craft of the film as well. Hall has a lot of interesting ideas about how to use negative space. She's working with a cinematographer called Edu Grau. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He's a Spanish filmmaker, probably best well known for doing A Single Man. He also shot Suffragette, the Sarah Gavran film. And so framing these characters within this boxy, 4:3 square frame, we often get shots where Rini is sort of very far off to either side of the frame or very much at the bottom of the frame, so you have lots of negative space filling it up. That's a pretty standard way of showing disconnect with a character in terms of framing, but it's very effective, so it's really good to see. What was more interesting to me was the ways in which we saw Rini's face be obscured. Faces obviously are kind of where identity is expressed, right? It's where we see other personalities. And so to obscure your main character's face at certain points throughout a film is quite a striking decision. Early on in the movie, when we see Renée in this white district of New York, she's wearing this kind of mesh hat. And so her chin is almost always bowed so that we're looking down. She's not looking at the camera. And so when the camera's looking at her, that means we're looking through that wire mesh. So we often see her eyes through this mesh for that first section of the film. And then actually in this moment where she meets this racist husband of her friend, he raises a glass to toast and it actually obscures her face. He puts it directly in front of her face. And again, later on when she receives a letter from Claire, she's in focus when she picks up the letter, and then she walks away out of focus. And instead of the camera focusing back like it normally would, she's left out of focus for the whole rest of that shot as she walks slowly down the stairs. So these are all different ways in which the filmmakers use cinematography and shot choice to obscure identity, I suppose, to obscure the site of identity, the face. And that really reflects the themes of the film in an interesting way. The film's also in black and white, which reflects the time of the film, where it's set, and there's a nice jazz soundtrack as well, which really matches the kind of feel that they're evoking. This idea of Harlem as a center of like intellectual and artistic activity during that period in New York's history. And that square frame as well, again, you know, brings us to mind of the classics, but also boxes in the characters. So we end up with this slightly claustrophobic feeling, I think, throughout the film. The film was shot with quite soft lenses, so it has that kind of vintage characteristic. And there's also lower resolution being used here. I read it was like not 4K, but 1.7 or 2K or something like that. So again, quite a soft image versus most of what Netflix tends to put out. Now, I've said the film's delicate about 3 or 4 times in this, and by that I mean that it's very still. The camera very rarely moves. There's very little connective tissue between shots. You tend to just jump from one day to another. There's not like establishers and things like that. However, that doesn't mean that it's self-indulgent. If anything, I think it's quite minimalist. And that's good to see. Sometimes when you watch an actor's first film as a director, I feel like it can feel a bit mannered. Like they make these very clear, strong, creative choices to tell the character story directly in a way that can feel arch sometimes. It's like a little bit hard to get away from the hand of the director. And although there are a number of strong style choices in this film, I actually think they add up to a film that's very delicate, that feels like a very light touch. And to be frank, sometimes it feels like a little too light of a touch. If you find it hard to pay attention in films that are very slow, you'll find this a challenging watch because very little happens on the surface of the movie. Almost everything is subtext and stillness. So just know that going in. That's it from me, and thank you for watching. But with a film that's so rich in its political ideas and the way that it looks at our identities and our lives, I'm sure there's going to be some fascinating discussions in the comments. So looking forward to having those with you. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.
Only another man.
Jane Campion is back to bless us with her first feature film since 2009 with The Power of the Dog. Benedict Cumberbatch and Jesse Plemons are 2 brothers who own a cattle ranch in 1920s Montana. Cumberbatch is a hard-walking, hard-talking, and pretty foul-smelling, by all accounts, cowboy, whereas his brother is becoming more sensitive, more attuned to a modern and maybe more genteel time. Already angry at his brother's changing ways, Cumberbatch becomes enraged when local woman Kirsten Dunst catches his brother's eye, and begins to victimize both her and her outsider son. The Power of the Dog is organised into chapters, each of which really focuses on a different pairing of its main characters that are all described in that potted introduction just there. Now, Cumberbatch is the star of the show, but everyone else gets really important moments there. And if anything, the whole story kind of boils down to explaining exactly why Cumberbatch is the way he is and how he got into that situation. So the first section really focuses on these 2 brothers, Phil and George, or as Phil calls him, Fatso. That's Cumberbatch and Plemons. Phil is an obviously very rugged and masculine guy. He even wears his boots to bed and apparently never seems to wash, apparently has never tried a modern bathtub. His favourite thing is to hide away at night, noodling away on his banjo, and he's obsessed with kind of staying on the ranch and working with the men there. But underneath all of that bravado, Cumberbatch is this unsettled and insecure character. Him holding on to those rituals is really part of him trying to make sure that he still has a place in this changing world, the changing West that he's in. And so instead of it just being, oh, that's Phil's way, that's how he wants to do things, it's really because he's holding on, he's clutching at straws, he's trying to keep these repeating rituals that he himself learnt from a famous cowboy who's kind of entered into memory there, which is Bronco Henry. And it's that intense focus on a very particular conception of what masculinity means that makes Phil so angry at Dunst's son. He spent his whole life working towards being this like hyper-masculine cowboy ranch-owning dude. And then he meets this quite effeminate kid who's very introverted and is very focused on like intelligence. He's studying to be a doctor later on in the film, and it just screws with his head. It's something that he cannot abide, he can't allow it to happen. And not only that, but making fun of this kid is a way of him shoring up his position with his brother, who is trying to move away from these rituals, who's thinking about ways they might modernize or even make more civilized, as it were, their operation and the men that they work with. And for all that Phil wants to stop things changing, it's actually him making fun of that kid that kicks off the plot, because that's why Plemons returns to and then bonds with Kirsten Dunst's character. Now, if you're not familiar with Campion's work, and I can't exactly blame you because, like I said, she hasn't done a movie in over a decade, although she has done some excellent TV in that intervening period, I think her films are, at their heart, always about the intersection between desire and power, and the ways in which articulating either of those things affects the other. It's quite common in Campion's film to see a really hyper-masculine character who then does these surprising and almost subversive things with his masculinity, maybe without even realizing it. And one good example would be Mark Ruffalo, of all people, playing this extremely masculine and quite misogynist in some ways police officer in The Cut, who nonetheless kind of turns out to have an interesting empathy and relationship with Meg Ryan, who's the lead character in that film. So for all of Cumberbatch trying to intervene and kind of shore up this masculine view in his brother's life, he ends up inviting this woman into his home. And that's something that's unbearable to him, so he starts to victimize her. Remembering that the Campion trademark is these kind of intersections between desire and power, you might think there's some sort of unspoken lust or kind of attraction between Cumberbatch and Dunst. But actually, as we find out, Cumberbatch's obsession with Bronco Henry masks something deeper, some deeper depth of feeling towards that now departed man. But that doesn't mean that he can't be furious at his brother finding happiness, or even maybe just finding what feels like a softer life with this woman. In one scene, he's lying asleep in his bedroom, which is next door to his brother's bedroom with his wife, and he hears them having sex, and absolutely fuming, he goes outside, goes down to the shed where he keeps Bronco Henry's pristine saddle with a plaque and a candle and everything, and he just starts to roughly work the lever. And Campion is always interested in textures and touch. And so we have this moment where we see this like very firm and almost rough sometimes, but at the same time strangely tender act of care towards this remnant of a possibly loved past life. You know, this person who was in this other person's life who's gone, and they're trying to keep their memory alive, or maybe just reminiscing over whatever their relationship contained, because we never get exactly an understanding of what that was. So in this second chapter of the film, we get much more of a focus on Cumberbatch and Dunst. And then in the next part of the film, we get more of a focus on Dunst and her son. And then the last part of the film, we get Cumberbatch and the son. And so there's this kind of shifting focus throughout the film that is very deftly handled by Campion. And without wanting to spoil it, the outcome of that is what is, I suppose, in the absolute sum of its parts, a thriller, but is much more of a character study of Phil and his relationships with the world and with himself. I've always been on the fence with Cumberbatch because I think when he tries, he's a really good actor, but he often falls into a comfortable niche for him, which is, of course, the insufferable genius. And I've had some disagreements with mates who've seen this film who feel like Phil is just another insufferable genius. But I think that's too shallow an analysis of the film. As far as I see it, Phil has a sense of himself as an insufferable genius. You know, this kind of master manipulator, and certainly that's how Dunst sees him. But there are several scenes where it turns out that he's just flat wrong, or he's misunderstood a context or a situation, and ultimately that's really where the plot lies. You know, he does all these schemes to try and get people to do stuff, and they end up backfiring on him. Right at the start, with him making fun of this kid, which ends up with his brother taking on his wife. And Cumberbatch's portrayal of that is excellent because he plays it completely straight. You know, there's no laughs in it. He's just flabbergasted when things go wrong for him. And yet he is also a really strong character, so we can feel for Dunst when she's being absolutely trod under his feet. There's an excellent set piece about a third of the way through the movie where Dunst has been asked to perform a piece of music for an important dinner party at the ranch because she used to be a piano or an organist player in a cinema in like kind of her previous life. And nervous with this grand piano that her husband's bought for her in this big echoey house, she tries to shut all the doors that she can and quietly practice. And as she's practicing and fumbling over these notes, she hears the banjo playing upstairs. And slowly Cumberbatch creaks open the door and plays it while looking at her down from the balcony, as if to say, anything you can do, I can do better. There's no place for you here. It's a wonderfully observed set piece, and I think it already ranks amongst the best of Campion's works. And it's also, I suppose, got a kind of in-joke in it, in the sense that Campion's most famous film by far is The Piano, about a virtuoso piano player, and the way in which he uses that to communicate with the world. And the opposite is true here, where this woman who is a very middling pianist cannot communicate with the world via that piano. So there's lots to dig into for the Campion fans with this movie, but I think it's also a really good jumping on point for anyone who hasn't seen her work previously, because it's much more accessible and more clearly structured than her more experimental work in, say, In the Cut, which has a lot of like weird montagey and associative stuff in it, or The Portrait of a Lady, which actually has like a very strange introduction. So yeah, check out Power of the Dog, which is currently on limited cinematic release and will eventually be available on Netflix, I believe December 10th worldwide. I'd love to hear what you thought about this densely layered character study come Western thriller. Let's have a chat in the comments below. Oh, and to say before we wrap up, if you haven't considered it yet, then maybe it's time to hit that subscribe button and to get more reviews like this one in your feed. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now. Married couple Maria and Ingvar live in an isolated sheep farm in Iceland, but their quiet existence is unsettled by a new arrival, Ada, a half-lamb, half-human child. Lamb kicks off with a long POV shot from the perspective of some intruder who isn't identified for a large amount of the movie's runtime, who works his way into the sheep pen and, you know, impregnates a sheep. Wow, it's a weird start to this review. Now, that opening shot is really striking, and it also shows the positives and negatives of this movie in a kind of microcosm. It's this long, single, unbroken take. It starts off with a fully white screen. It's in the middle of a snowstorm, and then slowly these black shapes resolve in the distance, which is a bunch of scared horses. And then we see in the sequence, you know, all these worried sheep, and we don't see the attacker here. So that means that we get this really slow building of tension in this gorgeous but very barren landscape, and then that tension kind of goes nowhere and does nothing. And that's basically what watching the whole movie is like. So if you want a sense of it, you can see it in the first 5 minutes. Maria, Noomi Rapace, is a well-observed version of like a quiet character. And you get the sense that she's not just quiet because that's her nature, but instead that she's withdrawn. She certainly seems to have an issue communicating with her husband, and it becomes clear quite quickly that there's something going on in their past that neither of them wants to talk about, which unfolds over the course of the movie. Now, pretty sharpish Ada comes into the story, although we actually don't see that she's this hybrid creature until quite a bit further on in the movie, which is a bit of a shame because, of course, the marketing is largely revolved around that. And why wouldn't you? It's like the most striking image in the movie by far. Just unfortunately, it's kind of treated as a twist in the actual text of the film, which doesn't really make sense considering that, well, it's in every shot of publicity for the movie. The couple immediately decide to take her in and name her, and it kind of is this unspoken thing. It ties into this central theme that runs throughout the movie about denial and kind of the dangers that come with it. You know, this idea that some things should be left unspoken and other things, if we don't discuss them or talk about what's wrong with them, then they might fester and become much more problematic. Now, if you watch the trailer for this movie, you're probably expecting it to be a horror, and internationally it's distributed by A24. In the UK, it's distributed by Mubi. Now, A24 has a kind of background in what we might call art house horrors or elevated horrors, if you like that term, which I don't, mostly because it's kind of snooty, and I think it implies that all horror is pretty bad except the ones that critics happen to like. And certainly that A24 trailer implies that this movie is going to be some kind of horror narrative. You know, you have this child who's kind of like a hybrid, a bit freaky looking, and then you have the threat of whoever her father is, basically. Now, in reality, and I know that the filmmakers don't really have much say in marketing, so I'm not saying it's their fault, the movie is actually much more of a family drama. And Ada, you know, far from being this horrific figure who's kind of portrayed in the trailers, is actually like very sweet and arguably one of the nicest things in the movie. Once they've decided to take in Ada, they get a cot from the shed, and then you realize that the thing that's going on between these two people is the loss of a child, that they had some kid at some point. It's not clear, I don't think, really how far along they were in that, either that pregnancy or in that child's life. But, you know, they're using this kid, this kind of unnatural, like hybrid child, as a replacement for that human child. And obviously bad things will come of that. And then about halfway through, Ingvar's brother shows up, who's kind of rebellious, and immediately is like taken aback by this animal slash child that has come into his brother's life. And he also seems to have some kind of past romantic relationship with Maria as well. Now, like I said, it's not the filmmaker's fault that it was marketed as a horror, but I have to say I think a horror version of this would be more interesting than the movie that we end up with. Ultimately, if you're being observant, you know, if you notice stuff like the cot coming out of the shed, you're pretty clear on what's going on between Maria and Ingvar straight off the bat. I'm talking maybe 30 minutes into this 2-hour film, and then it just kind of carries on as if that's going to be a twist, which eventually is kind of revealed as. And likewise, this relationship between Maria and Ingvar's brother, Petter, doesn't really go anywhere. It's not really part of the plot in any sense, although it does take up quite a lot of runtime of the movie. And yeah, I just found myself wishing that it had a bit of genre oomph behind it. I don't have a problem with slow movies. I mean, if you've watched the channel, you'll know I actually really enjoy quite a slow movie sometimes. But I want there to be something behind that. I want that to be part of how that story's told. And here, it just feels like almost like padding. Like there isn't really much of a story being told behind that slow stuff. And all those things you might get out of having the frame run on for a while longer, like noticing the power shift between people and the blocking and the conversations they have, doesn't really happen here because there isn't that depth of character, fundamentally. We don't really find out much about them. And it's not just the visual pacing that's slow, but the pacing of the storytelling as well. I was pretty astonished to find that the last 30 minutes of this movie contained 10 minutes about watching a football game and then getting drunk. None of which really ties into the plot at all, but is kind of portrayed in its entirety. Now, whether that's a specific cultural Icelandic thing that I'm just missing out on, I don't know. But what I can say as an audience member is that for me, when the movie should have been speeding up, it started to slow down even more. Now, I should say that the craft of the movie is really good. It's beautiful, all of the performances are on point, and I think the effects work, although it's limited and quite low budget, is really effectively used. But I just get this feeling that all of that is in search of a movie to hang itself on and doesn't find one. You know, the most interesting thing about this by far is its premise. And once you've seen that on screen in the first couple of minutes, the shock wears away and there isn't really much else to say, which is a shame, you know, because I'm always looking for a distinctive horror experience or something kind of art housey that takes on some of those genre tropes, or just something distinctive from a national cinema you don't see much of. And this movie pretty much falls short on all of those accounts. That's it from me, but as ever, I'd love to have a chat with you about this movie in the comments below. Have a good one, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.